After Empress Matilda had her crown usurped in the 12th century, it would be 400 years before the issue of a female queen was raised again. But the next woman to be put forward as Queen of England would hold the position for just 9 days. That young woman was Lady Jane Grey, who has been portrayed in history as an innocent, naive pawn who was pushed unwillingly into her place as queen. However, modern historians now believe she was an intelligent, politically aware participant in her fate, who understood the power she would wield had her queenship been successful. This video looks at her early life and the events that catapulted her from quiet noble to Queen of England. It's now assumed Jane was born sometime in May 1537, either in one of her parents' properties in London or her mother's house at Bradgate Manor in Leicestershire. She had a very royal lineage behind her. Her mother Frances was the daughter of Mary, Duchess of Sussex, the sister of Henry VIII. Her father, Henry Grey, the 1st Duke of Suffolk, was the great-grandson of Elizabeth Woodville through his grandfather. But she was not an only child, and she had 2 younger sisters, Lady Katherine and Lady Mary. The sisters were great-granddaughters of Henry VII, grandnieces of Henry VIII, and first cousins once removed of Edward VI, Mary and Elizabeth. Her parents' marriage had been convenient for them both. Her father gained material and political advantages, and her mother's family married into a family well favoured by Henry for helping to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Jane would begin her education in her early years. She was lucky to be born in a brief period of Tudor history when it was fashionable to educate daughters as well as sons, something that would later waver. She would first have to learn the householding skills of sewing, embroidery and cooking. Even noblewomen were expected, due to being female, to be able to create something culinary such as jam or preserves, or to sew items of clothing to give as gifts. But alongside this, Jane would learn reading, writing and mathematics to start with, going to learn French and Italian once she mastered writing English, and when she was 8, went on to complete Latin and Greek. Her tutor for these was John Aylmer, a brilliant academic who had graduated from Cambridge University. Jane excelled in her lessons, more interested in academic pursuits over anything else. Learning Latin and Greek had another purpose, of course. Learning these 2 languages allowed moral and religious beliefs to be instilled as early as possible in the children of the well-to-do, by being able to read the Bible in both medieval Latin and earlier Greek texts. However, which side of the religious fence someone came down on was still a sensitive and sometimes deadly area of debate. Divisions were clear even after Henry VIII's Reformation, not just from those who were Catholics, but even amongst the newly formed Protestants. Some adhered to the new beliefs, but wanted to retain conservative values from the Catholic faith, while others saw it as a confirmation for more radical changes. The Grey family definitely came down on the more evangelical side, raising their daughters as part of the first generation of radical Protestants. In 1546, Jane had her first taste of court. Her mother was a lady of the Privy Chamber to Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife of Henry VIII, and it gave her the perfect position in which to prepare Jane for her future role in serving the Queen. The Tudor court would have been a vibrant, bustling place, but it also held hidden meanings behind every smile, and court gossip was whispered in every corridor. By the time Jane came to court, Henry VIII was now an old man riddled with gout and jousting injuries, often spending days lying in his bed while pus from the wounds in his legs was dealt with by royal physicians. Catherine Parr, by contrast, was a youthful queen only in her early 30s, but who had experience of looking after ailing, aging husbands, having already been widowed twice. It wasn't long after Jane came to court that Henry VIII died in January 1547, and he was succeeded by his 9-year-old son and Jane's cousin, Edward VI. Just a few years before he died, Henry VIII had passed the third act of succession. This ensured that his son Edward VI came first in the line of succession, followed by any children he might have had with Catherine Parr, and finally, his daughters Mary and Elizabeth. In the outcome that all his children died, Henry decided the crown would then pass to those descendants of his younger sister Mary, Jane's grandmother, rather than his older sister, Margaret of Scotland. This put Jane and her sisters in the direct line for succession, a dangerous position later on. A few months later, Jane was sent to live with Thomas Seymour as his ward. He was the younger brother of the new Protector of England, Edward Seymour, and he was ambitious. Not only did he woo Catherine Parr and marry her not long after she became a widow for the third time, and was also given care of Elizabeth, her stepdaughter, but he also saw he could manipulate Elizabeth and Jane for his own ends. Jane was close to Edward VI, and if she married him, it would slow down Thomas Seymour's older brother's power, of which he was jealous. Although Jane's father was not on good terms with Edward Seymour, his daughter was only 10 years old, and at first he was hesitant, but he was soon convinced of his future position. Jane enjoyed the freedom this new chapter of her life gave her, despite her age. Not only that, but she would have found herself in a household of equals. While Princess Elizabeth did not grow close to her, she was regardless another intelligent young woman who shared the household with Jane, even if she preferred her own company. And Catherine was not only clever, but deeply religious as well, studying and promoting church reform. This can only have served to encourage Jane's academic pursuits and her own evangelical fervour. But this happy situation was not to last. In September 1548, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby girl. However, she also succumbed to a fever after childbirth, a deadly but not uncommon occurrence in a world before modern medicine. Jane was just 11, but she was asked by Thomas Seymour to be the lead mourner for Catherine's funeral. She performed this role to the letter, cutting a small but dignified figure as she led the procession to the chapel at Sudley, where Catherine's service was to be held. This was a significant funeral service, as the first Protestant funeral for a former royal queen. The service, spoken entirely in English without the trappings of Catholicism. Afterwards, she returned home, but understanding even in his grief the political pawn he would be giving up, Thomas Seymour wrote to Jane's father to ask for her to return as his ward. With the lack of a female presence in Seymour's household with Catherine's passing, and Thomas Seymour's fall in society now he was no longer her wife, Jane's parents were initially nervous in letting her go again, but eventually they did, lured by the repeated promises to match her hand in marriage to the king, Edward. It would be a grave error. This was not the adoptive home she had known a few months earlier. Seymour had taken his wife's death hard and was having a difficult time letting her memory go. At the same time, there were rumours that he wished to marry again, either to Princess Mary or possibly even to his young ward, Jane. Other rumours still whispered that he wanted to ask for Princess Elizabeth's hand in marriage. This alarmed many people surrounding Elizabeth, especially when Seymour discussed it more deeply with some members of her household. He was warned against his designs on marrying the princess by friends, but it fell on deaf ears. So certain was he that he could persuade Parliament to give him the governorship of the king's person over his brother, who was falling out of favour with many. Unfortunately for him, Sir William Sharrington, who was in charge of the Royal Mint and had been committing fraud for years and had been blackmailed by Seymour on this, was finally caught in the act. To prevent punishment for himself, he gave up all the information he knew on Seymour's plans to marry the Princess Elizabeth, Others gave up rumours of what he had said over past months about rounding up people in favour of the king and against his brother. Finally, a bill was passed charging him with high treason. On the 20th of March, 1549, he was taken to Tower Hill to be beheaded. Jane returned home, a mix of emotions. She had seen the death of people she came to view as an extended family, Katherine Parr, Thomas Seymour, and even their baby. But the experience also taught her to reflect more on her faith and to correct behaviour that might not be pleasing to God. In other words, she went deeper into being a Protestant. Henry Grey, Jane's father, was incredibly lucky to avoid serious punishment. He had remained a steadfast friend to Seymour throughout the whole affair, and gone so far as to say he would defend him against everyone but the king. He was interrogated on at least 4 occasions, but passed them, perhaps because despite his lack of judgment in becoming so close to Thomas Seymour, he had no direct hand in the plot for his friend to marry Elizabeth. Attention was now turned back to Jane and the proposition of who she should marry. With no more plotting from Thomas Seymour, there was no more question of her marrying the young King Edward. Instead, it was proposed that she should marry Edward Seymour, the younger son of the elder Edward Seymour, protector of the king. However, nothing came of this, and the idea was rejected both by Jane's step-grandmother Catherine Suffolk on the grounds of her not liking child marriages, and of John Dudley, then Earl of Warwick, as he had his own plans for her. Later in 1549, her father was elected to the Privy Council, along with new titles and lands that brought him increased wealth, straining relations with their mother's cousin, the Princess Mary, who was a publicly staunch Catholic. This situation became more dangerous for Mary, as Henry Grey wasted no time in expelling conservative nobles from the Privy Council, and this must have caused some difficulties between the Greys and Mary, although they did keep open the channels of communication. Politics in Tudor times meant keeping your options open, as everything could change quickly. By this point, Jane was excelling in all things she was taught, from her music and dancing to her Greek and Latin. However, she complained to her former tutor Roger Ascham that her life was made miserable by her parents' desire for her to be perfect in all ways, in that if she didn't behave in a manner which they thought should match her station, she was punished with pinches, nips and bobs, and other ways. While this statement was later used by Ascham to support his ideas that pupils should be treated kindly, it has been misrepresented throughout history to portray Jane's parents as needlessly cruel. However, the strict upbringing she had would have been the norm among her noble peers, and a letter written by Ascham just a few months later stated how proud her parents were of her achievements. The education Jane's father had paid for was normally reserved only for sons, but her parents chose to do this instead for their daughters. Naturally, this was a rigorous schedule, and unlikely to have been viewed adoringly by a teenage girl. In 1553, Jane Grey was finally betrothed to Lord Guildford Dudley, the 4th son of John Dudley, now styled the Duke of Northumberland. As a 4th son, Guildford had little reason to expect such a prestigious match, but the political implications of those around him made it happen. For the previous 2 years, King Edward had fought off various illnesses, and during a slight recovery, he wrote a will. Within it, he swept aside his sisters in line for the throne, and the Stuart line, as his father had done. Due to his evangelical tutoring, he believed that a ruling woman would be against the divine order of society, declaring that in the case of not having an heir himself, the crown was to pass to the male heirs of Lady Frances Grey. After her, it would fall to the male heirs of Jane, her sisters Katherine and Mary, and their cousin Mary Clifford in that order. However, Francis did not look likely to have any more children, and so it fell to the next generation to be married off and producing possible heirs. The Duke of Northumberland reportedly had to use threats and coercion to get Jane's parents to agree to the match, and even then, there were rumours that Jane herself was less than thrilled. She must have heard the talk about her becoming married to the king, and now she was being downgraded to a boy who was in line to inherit nothing after his 3 older brothers. There was a triple wedding on the 25th of March 1553 held at Durham House, the London residence of the Duke of Northumberland. The first couple were Lady Jane Grey and Northumberland's son, Lord Guildford Dudley. Next was her sister Katherine, just 12 years old, married to Henry Herbert, in line for his father's title of Earl of Pembroke. The third marriage was that of Catherine Dudley, Guildford's younger sister, who was married to Henry Hastings, heir of the Earl of Huntingdon. The occasion was a happy one, with much feasting, dancing and jousting tournaments for entertainment, but everyone could see the 3 marriages for what they were, political matches, to shore up support both for the Greys and the Duke of Northumberland. On the 28th of May 1553, the Duke of Northumberland was privately told by Edward's doctors that the teenage king did not have long to live. Edward himself redrew his will, making small but important changes that would create such chaos after his death. Where before he had simply left his crown to the so far non-existent male heirs of the Grey ladies, he inserted 2 words which would change this. Where before he had written Lady Jane, heirs male, now it read Lady Jane and her heirs male. This meant that now Jane was officially the next in line for the English throne, followed by her male heirs. Her mother Frances, not pregnant nor likely to be, was effectively written out of the line of succession, the same as Henry VIII had decided to do. Northumberland possibly had much to do with this decision, now his son was Jane's husband. Later sources state that it was Northumberland himself who told Jane that she was now the young king's heir, and apparently she was stunned and deeply upset. The news initially caused some upset between the 2 families, as Jane made her way back to her parents' home to tell them, and they were furious that Frances had been ruled out of the succession and suspected John Dudley was planning to crown his son Guildford through Jane. While Jane was comforted, the Duchess of Northumberland, Jane Guildford, threatened to keep Guildford with her and cause a scandal by the barely married couple being apart. But there was no point in the 2 families, who needed so much from each other and were now joined through marriage, bickering. Not long after, the young couple were reconciled, residing at Chelsea Manor, Catherine Parr's old home, which had been granted to Northumberland by King Edward. Meanwhile, Edward VI was growing ever closer to the moment of death. He requested Parliament ratify his will, offering pardons for anyone who might commit treason by following his wishes. While a few judges refused to agree to the new will, the majority of 14 did, and so it was passed. However, there was some anxiety that without the Act of Succession of 1544 being revoked, this would be a stumbling block later on. Frances Grey was summoned to the king's bedside, presumably to agree to being passed over for her daughter. Finally, on the 21st of June, the final legal document was drawn up, and the nobles and officials present would be expected to sign it. Edward explained pushing his 2 sisters out of the inheritance for the crown by declaring they were only his half-sisters, were considered illegitimate, and could marry foreign men. By contrast, Jane and her siblings were born in England, had married Englishmen, and had been brought up with the same heavily evangelical Protestant upbringing that Edward himself had. As July grew closer and Edward grew ever weaker, his sister Princess Mary came to see him, but warned that she could be seized on the way. she changed her route and fled to her estates in Norfolk and Suffolk, where she was popular and would be able to draw support to her cause. She would also be in a better position to flee abroad if it was needed. Some of the nobles were nervous about allowing Mary to remain as she was. The Duke of Northumberland was nonchalant about worrying over Mary's location, and possibly believed she would flee to Spain. He sent his son Lord Robert Dudley to go after her with a small number of men on horseback to bring her back to London, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. On the 6th of July, in the evening, the young Edward finally ended the torment he faced from his illness, uttering his last words, "Lord, have mercy upon me and take my spirit." The news was kept secret for 3 or 4 days. Northumberland especially suggested this, knowing there might be possible unrest with the news that Princess Mary was not to be, as the public would have expected, the next queen. Mary was well liked amongst much of the population, and her mother had been too. Jane was relatively unknown outside her circle of Protestant noblewomen, and the public would wonder why her mother had not come first, a woman in her mid-30s and with far more experience of politics and courtly life. On the 7th of July, the Mayor of London and the city magistrates swore an oath of allegiance to Jane as their queen, and she herself was taken to Sion, Northumberland's house in Richmond, Surrey. Mary had heard of her brother's death, but as it had still not been publicly announced, she bided her time. She would be charged with treason if she declared herself queen before he was actually dead. The next day, on the 8th of July, Northumberland and his noble supporters arrived at Sion to bend the knee to Jane and confirm she was now the Queen of England. She appeared overwhelmed, and her mother was called to help calm her. Jane was still only 16 years old. The assembled nobles, including her parents and her parents-in-law, the Northumberlands, knelt and swore to defend her. Jane, unexpectedly and dramatically, threw herself to the floor and sobbed. This single act has been read as the actions of an innocent, naive girl who was overwhelmed by the events happening around her and her reluctance to take the crown. However, in a world before newspapers and advertisements, a political message was instead demonstrated theatrically, communicated through posturing or left in symbols in paintings. Jane's act of shocked reluctance was a carefully thought out act to portray the right message, that she had not sought the crown, and that she was a grudging but willing participant only in the hands of fate. This was a young woman who was renowned as being one of the most academically gifted of her time, and she had shown on more than one occasion that she was not a timid girl, such as times she had openly questioned Princess Mary's attachment to the Catholic faith. With what is known of Jane's upbringing and her personality, her sudden collapse into a naive young teenager seems more a shrewd act for public appearances than an actual change from her vehement faith and sharp instincts. As the eldest, Jane, encouraged with her lessons and religious fervour, was brought up to be an outspoken advocate of her religion, and here was an opportunity to impress it deeply on the population as Edward had started. After Jane finished weeping, she came to her feet and gave a speech to those around her, indicating more modesty for the chance fate had thrown at her feet, but also asking that God grant her such grace as to enable me to govern. Her act was innocent enough, but she fully intended to rule by her own hand, not as the puppet of others. However, the way was not clear. Jane might have had the oath of the nobles around her and the signed device of succession written by Edward on his deathbed, but she needed the support of the people. And sadly for Jane, that belonged to the princesses Mary and Elizabeth. The king was dead. Long live the Queen! Lady Jane Grey was now Queen of England and Ireland, an entire kingdom in her grasp. Except this wasn't as simple as it all seemed, and tensions simmered not far beneath the surface. This video continues the story of Lady Jane Grey, picking up where she had just been informed of the king's death and her new fate. We look at the early days of her reign and how Jane went from a new hope to a woman fighting for her crown in less than a week. Although the news of Edward VI's death had been kept from the public for 3 or 4 days officially, it wasn't a well-kept secret, and rumours had escaped. Even if people weren't sure if he really was dead, they knew something was wrong and there was an uneasy tension amongst the populace. By contrast, a banquet was thrown at Sion House for Jane, her family and the nobles that made up the Privy Council. On the 10th of July, 1553, Jane stepped out onto a barge on the Thames, likely to be richly festooned with decoration befitting the situation. She was to make her journey to the Tower of London, to wait there until her coronation, as all monarchs before her had done. However, it had not been an easy few days for the Privy Council. A letter from Princess Mary, now safe in her stronghold of Norfolk, had arrived to break the peace. If the council had been hopeful on Mary quietly going away and retreating abroad, they were about to be disappointed. In the letter, she announced that she, not Jane, was the rightful queen, and she demanded they swear an oath to her. Even without the support of the Catholic Charles V in Spain, England now faced civil war and religious divides. Jane's reaction was amazingly calm. Despite the danger now posed, she truly believed she was following Edward's wishes in maintaining the Protestant faith. It was almost certain that Mary would reverse the clock and bring back Catholicism. The Privy Council were nervous, but later that day the procession made its way to the Tower as planned. They were met by crowds and a gun salute. A proclamation was read out, declaring Jane the rightful queen and Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate. No one cried out, "God save the Queen," as was customary. This was repeated around the city, but there is a story that gives some insight into how the crowds were feeling. Within Ludgate, a tapster, someone who was basically a waiter from one of the local taverns, decided to speak up. It was a teenager named Gilbert Potter, who at the end of the herald speaking, decided to loudly state that it was Mary who was the true queen. To punish his behaviour, he was put in the pillory, and the next morning he had his ears cut off. It did little to win sympathy over to Jane's cause. To make this worse, messengers arrived to inform those waiting within the tower that Mary had now declared herself queen from her power base in Norfolk. Understandably, the princess's household had anticipated what might happen and had been making their own preparations. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth had both been raised in the public eye and were well known and liked by the public, who knew them as daughters of a king. Jane, by contrast, was virtually unknown outside her circle of noble peers and just merely the niece of Henry VIII. She hadn't been given a public profile, as she was never raised to be a queen. The nobility needed to know each other, but they didn't need to win over the populace as the reigning monarch did. Although Jane was well liked within her social circles, she was a relative stranger outside them. Added to this was the public perception of the Duke of Northumberland, who, as her father-in-law, was inextricably linked to her. He was seen as a tyrant who had dominated the late King Edward's government and rule, and there were even rumours that the young king had died by Northumberland's hand. Despite this, as Jane landed at the Tower of London, she didn't show any sign that she was unnerved by the crowds. She may not have been born a princess, but she was still a Tudor, and she had the presence to match. To make matters worse, as she walked towards her home for the foreseeable future, her mother Frances picked up her train and carried it. Although her claim to the throne should have been stronger, her unlikelihood to produce any sons for the future of her royal line had set her aside. But the crowd, no doubt, would still have considered it strange to see a future queen, with her parents still alive, serving their daughter, far from being a continuous and stable line of succession. Making Jane queen was creating anxiety. Not everyone felt the same, however, and a gun salute rang out as Jane approached. The Privy Council were also there in force, showing deference by bending the knee as she passed, Northumberland himself kneeling and handing the new queen the keys for the tower, and it's likely she would have looked the part. Although few genuine descriptions of Jane's appearance exist, she would have been richly dressed, bedecked with jewels and furs to highlight her regal status. The chronicler Richard Grafton, who was one of her supporters, described Jane as beautiful, virtuous and wise. After Jane and her husband Guildford were ushered into the tower, she reportedly was then presented, while seated on the throne, with the crown jewels by the Marquis of Winchester, William Paulet. Up to this point, Jane had kept an air of composure and cool certainty, but the enormity of the situation must have come crashing down with the sight of the golden crown. Winchester, who was also the Lord High Treasurer, asked her to put it on my head to try whether it really became me or no. Jane reportedly refused to do so, stating that the crown was not hers. However, there are letters from this time signed Jane the Queen, certainly the definitive actions of someone who believed themselves the monarch. With some persuasion, Jane relented and placed the crown on her head, resplendent to the onlookers. But then Winchester added, "Another also should be made, to crown my husband." While she said nothing, Jane already suspected this had been the plan of Northumberland all along, and she had already made her mind up about this, along with many other things. Even if she was nervous at being queen, she was prepared to rule like one. But the comment stayed in Jane's mind, and she and Guildford then had a blazing row, ending with Jane agreeing he would be made king in September, but only until he left the room. She then changed her mind, calling for witnesses and declaring that she would only consider making Guildford a duke, not a king, possibly the Duke of Clarence. The Duchess of Northumberland, Guildford's mother, was furious at the treatment of her son, and she gave him advice to shun the marriage bed and leave the tower with his mother. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was horrified at these events. It seemed Jane was not as easy to bend to his designs as he had hoped for. In fact, she was proving to be every inch the confident, opinionated teenager she had shown before her ascension. If this is true, it shows several things about Jane's character. While she was a wife and had agreed to obey her husband in her marriage vows, she understood her role as queen went above this. It also shows how she saw her inherited crown. It had been handed to her and her alone by Edward, with the firm implication that she was to defend the Protestant faith. Jane no doubt understood it would be her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, who would worm his way into abusing his son's power if he were king. And finally, she knew her own mind. But to outsiders who may have been wavering, there was a divide in her household. For Guildford's part, he took this badly, insisting still on being addressed as Your Grace and sitting at the head of the council table. This just proved further to Jane that he was unsuited to the role of a king who had to think beyond his own wants and desires. With first impressions out of the way, Jane and her household set about mobilizing the population behind her with the central decisive issue her queenship was based on: religion. Notices were sent out proclaiming the Catholic faith to be dangerous, signed by Jane the Queen. But it wasn't enough to simply proclaim Mary's claim invalid and condemn the Catholic religion. Mary had to be captured and brought back to London, where she could be kept under control. And on the 12th of June, Jane had decided to send her father with an army to fetch Mary, and people in London were invited to fight in Queen Jane's defence. However, there were suspicions from many that Northumberland was planning a secret deal with the French King Henri II to place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne if Jane didn't do as he wanted. This fueled anxiety and tension already clear in the council, and when Jane's father was too ill to lead the army on the morning of the 14th, the Privy Council elected the Duke of Northumberland himself. There was no way for him to refuse without confirming he wanted to stay and impose his own rule through the young queen, so he accepted, but was well aware he would likely be stabbed in the back. When the army set off, crowds came out to see them, but none cheered or wished them well. Word also came from East Anglia that towns were rapidly changing allegiance to Princess Mary, and 5 royal ships off the coast had mutinied in her support. Queen Jane also found out Mary had been proclaimed Queen in Buckinghamshire. At Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, Princess Mary had gathered her own forces. She may have been a woman, but she was the granddaughter of the warrior queen Isabella of Castile, and was not afraid to fight. There is a description of her army that the infantry made ready their pikes, the cavalry brandished lances, the archer bent his bow, each man kept rank and did not even move a finger's breadth from the position assigned him. Reportedly, Mary herself came down from her horse to inspect the troops and stopped to speak to many of them. It can only have endeared her more to them. However, Jane was unfazed by this. With no Duke of Northumberland there to encourage anything, she alone wrote letters to sheriffs and justices of the peace to remind them who their allegiance should belong to, and that they had a duty to defend Jane as their queen against strangers and papists. It seems Jane was, by her own hand, certain of her place now, and of her part in defending the religion her parents had so vehemently impressed upon her. How Jane was viewed in terms of her power, however, was clear in reports sent to Spain from the imperial ambassadors of King Philip II. They exaggerated much in their reports, but they also mentioned how much the people loved Princess Mary and how much they hated the Duke of Northumberland and his children. There was little or no mention of Queen Jane in their reports, showing that it was clear they viewed her only as a figurehead for Northumberland to use for his own ends through the connection of her royal blood to his son. But whether Jane truly was behaving as a queen or not, she was doing little to claim the hearts and minds of her country. On the 16th, the Bishop of London attempted to win over Londoners by preaching at St. Paul's Cross, repeating the news of King Edward's death, of Mary and Elizabeth's illegitimacy, and of Jane's right as queen. This time, the crowds didn't just stay silent. They spoke up in defence of Mary, muttering amongst themselves. Rumours abounded that Princess Mary had gathered nearly 30,000 men for her forces. Whatever the truth, the mood in London made the Privy Council nervous, and they strengthened the guards of the Tower. It was impossible to hide the hostility the public now had against Jane being queen, and now her only chance of hanging on to her claim to the crown was the success of Northumberland's mission. By the 17th of July, the Duke of Northumberland and his men had made it to the town of Bury St. Edmunds. He attempted to recruit men along the way, armed with impressive cartloads of weaponry to arm his new soldiers. However, the response was worse than lukewarm, and few came forward. Many in the area had already sided with Princess Mary, Aware that the situation was not going the way he hoped, Northumberland and his men turned around and instead headed for Cambridge to raise a force there. Cambridge was the heartland of the Protestant faith at that time, but even there the numbers were thin. One thing was becoming clear: Jane's reign looked as though it was in its last days. Support was also draining away in London. The Privy Council could not fail to know the whispers and rumours that the people were against Jane's rule, and each one found a way to slip out of the Tower unnoticed. By the evening of the 18th, Jane was left with only her parents, husband, mother-in-law, and ladies-in-waiting by her side. She must have felt sick to her stomach. Northumberland had promised her the crown, and the entire Privy Council had bent the knee and sworn to defend her. For Jane, this was no greedy grab for power, but a place she had taken on the demands left by Edward VI. Thrust into a position she had not trained for, she had considered herself nonetheless the defender of her faith and therefore her country. But the reality was who you know, not what you know, and unfortunately, no one knew her well enough to consider how well she might rule. Many people also recognised Princess Mary as the legitimate daughter of Henry VIII, and so viewed Jane as little more than a usurper, puppeted by the Duke of Northumberland. But now Jane found herself isolated, at the centre of a far bigger storm than anyone had foreseen, and their only hope now was to await news from Northumberland and hope he won through by some miracle. On the morning of the 19th, William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, and the Earl of Arundel, Jane's uncle, met with the rest of the council at Pembroke's house of Baynard's Castle, further along the River Thames. For these two men, their involvement was much more sticky. Pembroke's son was married to Lady Katherine Grey, Jane's sister, and they resided in his property. Jane was Arundel's niece, although he was an ardent Catholic, unlike her parents. Arundel gave a speech, urging all present to instead proclaim the Princess Mary Queen, and to forget their alliance to Jane, as they were merely righting a wrong. They signed a document to that effect, casting aside the will of Edward or their oath to Jane. Pembroke was already planning to ask for an annulment between Katherine and his son, to distance himself from the whole family. They then declared they would ride for Cheapside to declare Mary Queen. Jane, with no knowledge of this except that her council had deserted her, had agreed to be godmother to the infant son of Edward Underhill. Underhill was a firm Protestant and stalwart supporter of Jane, one of the Tower's warders, and his son was to be christened in a nearby church. Although Jane did not attend in person, instead sending one of her ladies-in-waiting in her stead, it was her honour as godmother to choose the child's name. She chose Guildford after her husband. This was perhaps a show of unity against the outside world. Outside, those few nobles still loyal to Jane were trying to prevent Mary from being publicly pronounced queen, and one, Sir Nicholas, barely escaped being lynched by the crowd by being helped to a horse to ride away as the crowds were held back. Things were getting ugly. The nobles of the council pushed their horses through the throngs of people urging them on to St. Paul's. There, they loudly read out the proclamation that the Lady Mary was now Queen of England, France and Ireland. Unlike the announcement of Jane's queenship, the people present erupted into cheers and lit bonfires. Pennies were thrown to the crowd, and the news spread fast. But still, no one had bothered to tell Jane, anxiously awaiting news in the Tower. This shows the blatant disregard the council had for the teenager, a mere girl in their eyes, who had been nothing more than a vial of royal blood for Northumberland to abuse as he wanted. The letters she had written in her own hand, the ardent firmness with which she had decided on a course of action against Mary, the composure and dignity she had shown, the promises given to the boy king Edward, all were forgotten as unimportant in the face of avoiding civil war and saving their own skins. Soldiers arrived at the tower, and Jane's father, Henry, the Duke of Suffolk, told his men to lower their arms. He knew that his daughter's reign was over. Rather than be arrested, he left the tower and signed the new proclamation declaring Mary the Queen, before returning to tell his Jane the news she must have been dreading. Jane remained calm and dignified as her father gently told her she was no longer queen, reminding him that he had helped convince her to take the crown alongside others. Jane accepted her fate. The state canopy was taken down, and Jane, along with her mother and ladies-in-waiting, retreated into an inner apartment of the tower. Despite her resolute response, Jane must have been worried. Being declared queen no more did not simply mean she was pushed to one side and forgotten about. There would be consequences. The world had crumbled around her. Not long after, also fearing for their daughter's life, Francis and Henry Grey travelled to Baynard's castle to speak with Pembroke, hoping to convince him to lay the blame solely on Northumberland and his family for what had occurred. However, back in the tower, Jane was held a prisoner there, alongside her mother-in-law and husband. It was clear who was going to be considered for blame, and unfortunately, Jane was at the centre. Northumberland, still in Cambridge, heard the news and lost no time switching sides with his tail between his legs. He sent Mary a letter, begging for forgiveness and asking what orders she wanted him to carry out as her loyal servant, reading out the proclamation the following day and publicly declaring for Mary. The Duke of Northumberland's entire future rested on the mercy of Queen Mary, something that wasn't likely. The Earl of Arundel arrived shortly afterwards to arrest him. A friend of John of Ulm, a German academic Jane had once exchanged letters with, wrote to him, stating, "Jane was queen for only 9 days, and those most turbulent ones, the origins of the term 9 days queen, when in fact Jane had reigned for 13 days. The die had been cast. Mary was now Queen Mary, and the entire Privy Council had declared in her honour. For the population outside, they were cheerful and full of joy at their beloved Princess Mary, who had been given, as they saw it, her rightful inheritance, and also the downfall of the hated Northumberland. They celebrated, and pamphlets were cast around the city extolling Mary and scorning Northumberland, but there was no mention of Jane, who was far from in a celebratory mood. She waited in the tower, alongside only her husband, her mother-in-law, the Duchess of Northumberland, and her ladies-in-waiting, hoping to hear of merciful news from Mary, her cousin, forgiveness for what had been done. Jane's fate was now in the hands of the new monarch, and although her own reign had seemingly been forgettable, she was now about to become a legend as a prisoner in the Tower of London. Jane's short reign as queen was over. With Mary now proclaimed Queen of England, France and Ireland, Lady Jane Grey was once again merely a member of the nobility and a prisoner of the dreaded Tower of London. Separated from her parents and cast down from the throne, Jane was about to become something other than a confident teenager or a sudden queen. She was about to become a legend amongst the Protestants of England. After she had officially renounced her queenship, Jane, her husband Guildford and her mother-in-law the Duchess of Northumberland were the only people left in the royal apartments of the Tower. The guards who not so long ago had been there to serve Jane were now her jailers, taking the opportunity to mock them. Even her ladies-in-waiting had left when they were able. Her mother and father had already left the Tower as well, to do what they could to save their daughter. Jane, Guildford and the Duchess of Northumberland retreated into an inner chamber of the Tower, no longer permitted to remain in the royal apartments. Soon Mary would arrive to prepare for her coronation, and would have need of them herself. The guards arrived to remove the prisoners to different places within the tower instead. Guildford was taken to the 13th century Beauchamp Tower, an imposing structure built with thick stone, while Jane was taken to a house on Tower Green, belonging to one of the jailers, Nathaniel Partridge. Jane was now stripped of anyone familiar, with only Partridge and 3 ladies assigned to her for company. Her own ladies-in-waiting were now all outside the tower, having fled a punishment for being by Jane's side. The public outside now knew Jane and Guildford were prisoners in the tower, and they were soon to be joined by Jane's father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland. In less than a fortnight, she had gone from being a young noblewoman to a queen to a prisoner. Her head must have been spinning. All she could do now was wait, helplessly, to see if fate might show her some mercy. Ironically, over at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, Mary was still unaware that she had been proclaimed Queen in London, and was still raising troops to fight for her crown. On the evening of the 20th, 2 men from the Privy Council arrived unexpectedly in the courtyard of the castle, with the news Mary had been waiting for. One was Sir William Paget, and the other was Henry Fitzalan, Jane's uncle, the Earl of Arundel. Just a few weeks before, they had sworn their allegiance to Queen Jane, but now they abandoned all association with the oath, instead kneeling and proclaiming Mary their queen. Now that Jane's reign was at an end, the foremost concern was saving their own heads. They begged Mary for forgiveness. But Mary was merciful in her moment of triumph, and the 2 men were pardoned graciously. Her kingdom had been won without a war breaking out, and soon after, many other nobles followed suit. They were all granted mercy by Mary, who first arranged for her chaplains to give thanks to God, who she saw as the instigator of her triumph. It was clear that, like Jane, but on opposing sides, Mary's faith was as much her rock in times of trouble as it was for her younger cousin now locked in the tower. On the 24th of July, Queen Mary, as she was now known, set off for London. Whatever opinions were of Mary, she had waited a long time for her rightful inheritance. Now, at the age of 37, she couldn't hope to compete with the youthfulness of Jane. While she was loved and adored by the people of her country, some of the chroniclers describing her didn't hold back. One stated that she was of low rather than middling stature, with her family's auburn hair, and another stated that her voice was rough and loud, almost like a man's, so that when she speaks she is always heard a long way off. This, of course, could be seen as a very great quality for a woman who was about to be queen in her own right, but the anxiety of misogynists was never far behind the description of a woman who would rule. However, another witness also said Mary showed herself to have been born of truly royal lineage. In other words, there was no mistaking this contender to the throne, unlike Jane, now viewed as a usurper. The Duke of Northumberland had been apprehended by his former ally and Jane's uncle, the Earl of Arundel. He was arrested. Their destination was clear, and on the 25th of July, they arrived in London with a guard of around 3,000 to make their way to the Tower. The crowds were looking for blood when they heard Northumberland was on his way, so much so that Arundel asked Northumberland to remove his famous red cloak and cover his face in order to not be recognised. They were still met with a barrage of rocks, stones and insults hurled in equal measure. The Duke of Northumberland's younger son, Henry, who was only 16, couldn't hold back his tears. But at the same moment, another boy about the same age burst through the crowd and ran up and down the road brandishing a sword and yelling. The boy had no ears. The same Gilbert Potter who had been mutilated early in Jane's reign for proclaiming Mary the true queen. No doubt, He would now be an ardent supporter of Queen Mary for the rest of her life. While the arrival of the males from the Dudley family would have added to Jane's worries about her own fate, it's likely her father's incarceration in the Tower on the 27th of July was more distressing. Only her mother remained now to try and save the lives of her family, and Francis Grey immediately set off to meet with Mary at Beaulieu, arriving at 2 in the morning on the 29th of July. It was no doubt a nerve-wracking night of waiting for the morning with little sleep, but Francis and Mary had long been close. They were cousins, close in age, who had spent much of their childhood together. And many years before, when Henry VIII had been considering how to end his marriage with Mary's mother, Katherine of Aragon, it was Francis who had petitioned her uncle not to abandon his wife. After her prayers, Mary met with Francis, who begged forgiveness for her family and placed the blame squarely on Northumberland. The illness of Jane's father, Henry Grey, who had been so ill he hadn't been able to lead an army to capture Mary, was put down to poisoning by the Duke of Northumberland. This fed into a rumour flying around that Northumberland had poisoned Edward VI as well. Francis further claimed he would then have crowned Guildford as king alongside Jane, with the protecting influence of her father gone, or even have placed the young Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. While some exaggeration could be understood in the circumstances, Francis pushed it to the limit. The truth, of course, was that Jane had sent an army after Mary and signed documents declaring both Elizabeth and Mary illegitimate. Jane had made her own decisions very firmly, but they had been on the honest belief that it was the late king's wishes and that she was the rightful queen to maintain Protestantism. However, Mary was known to be a forgiving person, and no doubt she remembered how Francis had tried to help her mother. Jane, after all, was family. Although she wished to pardon both Jane and Henry Grey, the Spanish ambassadors from her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, were horrified and convinced her that Jane, at least, should stay in the Tower to prevent scandal and danger. Henry Grey, however, was pardoned the next day, but he remained in the Tower for another 2 weeks, recovering from his illness. The fear he might be close to death was equalled only by the family's fear for Jane. Far from being pardoned, she was charged with treason, a sentence that carried death by execution. At the time, being charged with treason did not mean a fair trial would be carried out, but that someone had already been proclaimed guilty, and the trial was a message to the public of Jane's wickedness. On the 3rd of August, Queen Mary finally made her triumphal entrance into London, dressed in a violet velvet dress, the sleeves and skirts embroidered with gold thread. It was a tremendous occasion, the public cheering on their new queen as she was greeted on her way to the Tower of London. It couldn't have been more different to Jane's journey to the Tower. One of the first tasks ahead of her was to oversee the burial of her brother, Edward. Through the events of the last 2 weeks, Edward still lay unburied in state at Westminster. On the 8th of August, his body was finally laid to rest. Mary wanted a full Catholic Mass said for him, presumably to ensure he was covered on all fronts in the next life, but those around her advised it would be better to say Mass for his soul in private instead, while his public Protestant funeral went ahead. At this point, Mary doesn't seem to have been as zealous about how her subjects worshipped as she was later. A few days later, she issued a proclamation settling the matter of religion as by common consent. For now, saying people should worship the religion they thought best. This could be best translated as, you can be Protestant for now, but quietly. Although Mary was now going to stay at the royal apartments for a while, Jane was unable to have a personal audience with her. She turned her considerable skill with words into action instead, writing a letter to her mother's cousin. The original letter doesn't survive, but at least 2 accounts state that Jane was deeply remorseful, asking her forgiveness in her unwise decision to, as she put it, listen to those around her who told her to wear the crown. It was a smart letter, whatever the outcome. Jane was able to completely give a heartfelt confession for her actions in taking the crown, but equally, she was careful to remind that others in much higher positions than herself had orchestrated everything. She also stressed how she had never sought out the crown for herself, which would seem to be true. She even stated that Guildford and his mother had treated her badly, perhaps a hint that she feared what they might do if she didn't comply. There was no love lost between her young husband and herself, it would seem. She even repeated her mother's claims of poison, saying that she herself had been poisoned twice, once making her hair fall out. Although the truth of this is unknown, as Northumberland would surely have needed her alive. Nevertheless, it added to his guilt. The next big event for London was the trial of John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. The biggest irony of this trial was that most of the judges had also signed the oath stating Jane should be queen. His main argument was that he had done nothing without their agreement and under the great seal of Jane, to which they argued the seal of a usurper was worthless. The evidence against Northumberland was damning, and he had been caught on the wrong side of the events. The verdict was treason, and he was sentenced to die. The usual death for a traitor would be to be hanged, drawn and quartered, and Northumberland begged Mary to allow him the privilege of a beheading and to pardon his children. At that point, this was as much mercy as he could hope for. Even if others had also involved themselves just as much in the scheme to get what they wanted from it, Northumberland had been chosen as the scapegoat, and as much blame as possible was heaped on him, along with what he rightfully deserved for his part. But even at this point, he thought there might be a chance of a pardon, and he asked for a learned man of the clergy to visit him, suggesting he might be considering a conversion to Catholicism. On the morning of the 21st of August on Tower Hill, the axemen and a large crowd of up to 10,000 gathered to see the Duke of Northumberland's last moments. However, an hour went by and no one appeared on the scaffold. Instead, if Jane had looked from her window, she would have seen Northumberland, along with others condemned for the crime of treason, being led into the small chapel of the tower. Within, Mass was performed, and Northumberland proclaimed to the congregation inside that Catholicism was in fact the very right and true way, and that he and others had been seduced these 16 years past by Protestantism. It made no change to his sentence, only the date. The next morning, Northumberland again went to Mass, but this time was fetched a short time after to wait his turn on the scaffold, wearing a grey-coloured cloak of damask. He mounted the steps to the scaffold and turned to face the crowd across the railing. He announced his crime and asked for forgiveness as he gave his life as the Queen had demanded. But Northumberland also made sure to state that he was not the only one who had planned to place Jane on the throne, and even suggested he was not the original schemer of the plan. But it was too late now to change fate. Kneeling on the straw and placing a blindfold over his eyes, the Duke of Northumberland lay down and was beheaded with one stroke. The large crowd gave a deafening roar of approval. Mary, at this point, was still determined to pardon Jane once her trial was over and she was no longer the gossip of the town. Jane's mother and father did their part in providing Mary with reasons to give forgiveness. They said Jane had no knowledge of the plan to usurp the throne until a later stage, which was possibly mostly true. Jane had been told by Northumberland before Edward's death that she was in line for the throne, but she hadn't necessarily understood the full truth of what that meant, or might have understood it as her sons would become heirs. Whatever the truth, her parents also added that the marriage between herself and Guildford wasn't even valid, as she had been previously promised to a low-ranking member of Bishop Gardiner's household. This would have made her safely married low enough to have been excluded from the succession, but nothing was heard of the potential groom again, and no one was much impressed by this. However, the ambassadors sent messages back to Spain stating that Mary had decided not to put Jane to death due to her family connection and her young age, and that although Mary would take the greatest possible care for the future, she would be setting Jane free. A week later, her future still up in the air, Jane met with Roland Lee for dinner in the Tower, an official from the Royal Mint, and Nathaniel Partridge, her jailer and Lee's friend. Sat at the head of the table, Jane was cheerful and confident, raising a glass to Lee and asking him to keep his cap on, having removed it in her presence. Her imprisonment, so far away from her family or friends, meant that any interaction with others was precious to her now. During the meal, Jane proclaimed loudly that Queen Mary was a merciful princess. I beseech God she may long continue. She had no doubt heard the rumours that she was to have her life spared, and perhaps one day even be free of the Tower. But as dinner talk turned to religion, Jane also revealed she was under no illusions on what Mary's plans were, despite the current compromise of worshipping as people chose. Mary was staunchly Catholic, and she would, as soon as possible, return her kingdom to the papacy of Rome. The conversation turned angry as Northumberland's conversion was brought up, and Jane furiously stated her hatred towards him, that he had abandoned what she believed to be the true faith. In her eyes, he had risked his immortal soul, and she loudly proclaimed that she would rather die than convert, surprising the diners present with the vehemence of her words for so young an age. Soon, Jane would get her turn to publicly stand up for her faith. The 13th of November was the date of her trial, and Jane was led out of the Tower alongside Guildford and two of his brothers, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. The prisoners were led through the streets to London's Guildhall, the place for their trial. Guildford had dressed to impress in a black velvet doublet slashed with white satin, but it was Jane who stole the show as the prime prisoner. She was dressed completely in black, a sign of her regret for her crimes, her cape and French hood both trimmed in further black detailing. However, she also carried a Bible in her hands, another hanging from her waist trimmed in black velvet, both a symbol of her rebellious feelings towards the papacy creeping back into England. Reportedly, she remained, as she always seemed to in these stressful political situations, the image of cool composure, even as she was read the verdict from the judges of her trial: death, by being burned alive. But all was not yet lost. Rumours were spread that the Grey girls were actually illegitimate, as their father Henry had been betrothed to the sister of the Earl of Arundel before marrying Francis, something that would have saved them by taking them out of the line of succession. It was well known Mary's feelings were to spare her young cousin, and Jane's father threw all he had into saving his daughter. He professed undying loyalty to Mary, and even said Mary should marry whoever she wished, even Philip of Spain, Charles V's son. The idea filled even Mary's most steadfast followers with horror, as they feared England and Wales being swallowed into the juggernaut of the Habsburg Empire. When the news came out late in November that she had in fact already accepted his betrothal in a secret meeting, it was very unpopular. Unrest bubbled beneath the surface, especially amongst those who still felt deeply for Protestantism. On the 26th of November, a group of evangelicals who were close to the Grey family met to plot uprisings across the country. One of them, a man called Thomas Wyatt. He was the son of Elizabeth Brooke, a woman who had once been considered for the position as Henry VIII's sixth wife. Another of the group was Henry, Jane's father. The men planned to replace Mary with her Protestant sister Elizabeth. It was a huge risk for the safety of Jane, but if her impassioned speech to Lee and Partridge was anything to go by, she would have been proud of her father for defending what he believed to be the true religion. Queen Mary still knew nothing about these plans when from the 18th of December, Jane was permitted by her to walk in the Queen's garden instead of being shut in her rooms, finally able to breathe in the cool, crisp winter air. Her next step was to pardon Jane and send her home to her parents, but Mary had not understood the strength of Jane's religious convictions. There would be no conversion to the return of the old faith. In fact, Jane had prepared a letter damning those who attended Mass, a letter which would be widely circulated in England and Europe. Her letter was addressed to Thomas Harding, a former tutor of the Grey Sisters who had recently converted to Catholicism. In it, Jane stated, "I cannot but marvel at thee, and lament thy case," her coldly constructed words damning him for his choice, and describing him as the deformed imp of the devil. She went further, decrying all those who had accepted the crown's return to papacy rather than fighting against it. So venomous was this letter that later Victorian admirers of Jane refused to believe that such a sweet, innocent girl could have written it. Her letter proved that although Jane was only a teenager, she had an inner strength of faith that was steel-like in its intensity. She had no interest in hiding her opinions. Meanwhile, her father and the other rebels had firmed up their plans by the 22nd of December. The revolt would take place late in March. Smaller uprisings would take place across the country before the leaders converged to take London. Whether or not Jane had initially meant her letter as pertaining purely to spiritual matters, it would be taken as a proclamation to physical force. Although Jane had never sought the crown for herself, it doesn't mean she wanted Catholic Queen Mary to be ruler either, especially when her sister Elizabeth was a Protestant. One of the rebels, Sir Peter Carew, told Henry Grey he would personally lead Mary to the Tower and take Jane from it. Then Bishop Gardiner, friends with another of the rebels, Edward Courtenay, caught wind of the plot on the 21st of January. Henry's brother Thomas wrote to warn him that the plan had been discovered and rumours were flying around at court. Thomas told his brother that he would surely be put back in the Tower and should start the revolt at once. Still ill and unable to think clearly, Henry agreed. Although a few abandoned the plan and fled abroad, Wyatt remained and began his part of the revolt in Kent. Henry Grey was yet to leave his home when a messenger from Queen Mary arrived. Still unaware of his role in events, Mary wanted to give him the chance to prove his loyalty to the crown by leading an army against Wyatt. Telling the messenger he was already on his way to the Queen, Henry dismissed him as quickly as he could before riding to meet with his brothers. They had no army raised, little cash upon their persons, but once they failed to arrive at court they were declared traitors. Nobles went after him, but he managed to evade capture for a while. Proclamations were sent out from his side that declared the fear that England would be handed to Spain was true, and that anyone who would oppose the marriage would be given 6pence a day. However, the marriage contract between Mary and Philip had been published a few weeks before, stating that Philip was to have the title king, but no powers over England whatsoever. A few days later, Henry Grey was caught. But when the rebels in Kent found out, having grown in numbers, they marched into London and surrounded Bishop Gardiner's palace, setting it alight. The guard was increased around Whitehall and the Queen's chambers, and that cannons at the Tower of London were moved around to fire at rebels on the other bank of the River Thames. Wyatt moved ever closer into the royal heart of the capital, making it more dangerous for Jane. While the intention for the rebels was to crown Elizabeth, this wasn't clear to Mary, and Jane, and to a lesser degree Guildford, were both still beacons for the rebels' cause. It had become too dangerous to let them live after all, and the next day, Mary condemned them both to die. The only small mercy was that their respective sentences of being hanged, drawn and quartered or burned alive were changed to beheading. But Jane would not go out with a whimper. Knowing by now that Jane's father would soon arrive at the Tower, Guildford used an old prayer book to pass on a message to his father-in-law. He wrote, Your loving and obedient son wisheth unto your grace long life in this world, with as much joy and comfort as I wish to myself, and in the world to come, life everlasting. Your humble son to his death, G. Dudley. Somehow, this book was then passed into Jane's hands, and she added her own message below. The Lord comfort your grace, and that in his word wherein all creatures only are to be comforted. And though it has pleased God to take away 2 of your children, yet think not, I most humbly beseech your grace, that you have lost them, but that we, by losing this mortal life, have won an immortal life. It would appear that Jane had accepted her fate, and was ready to go on into the next life as a martyr to her cause. The rebels continued pushing on to the Queen, and the executions for the 7th of February were abandoned, as Mary was warned she should leave for her own safety. Queen Mary bravely refused, declaring herself mother of her people and sending her army out against the rebellion. The battle continued throughout the day, but finally, before 5 p.m, the rebels were defeated. Jane and Guildford would have heard prisoners being brought into the tower, Thomas Wyatt chief amongst them. Mary, once again feeling safe, wavered in her decision to execute Jane and Guildford. There was no need to kill them now, but those advising her thought differently, and they convinced Mary that the deed had to be done. The warrant was signed, and the deaths of Jane and her husband were scheduled for the 9th of February. Still hopeful she could persuade Jane to convert and save herself, Mary sent her personal chaplain John Feckenham to see her cousin. He had been a prisoner himself in the Tower during Edward's reign, and was known as both merry and highly persuasive. When he arrived in Jane's room, however, she dismissed him, saying that he was too late and she had to prepare to die. Feckenham was moved, and he begged the Queen for a few extra days in order to speak more to Jane. Mary readily agreed, probably as desperate to prevent the death of her young relative, and the sentences for both Jane and Guildford were commuted to the 12th. When Feckenham returned to see Jane, he said how sorry he was to see her how she was, but Jane smoothly retorted that she saw her imprisonment as a manifest declaration of God's favour towards me, a chance to repent her sins before going on to heaven. On Jane's final night alive, she spent it writing letters to those she loved. To her father, she wrote a letter of comfort, stating that it was not by his hand that she was in the Tower, but that they had all just been doing the will of God. No letters to her mother Frances or her younger sister Mary exist, but it's possible they did exist and were later destroyed by Frances to keep her remaining daughters safe. Jane's letter to Katherine encouraged her 13-year-old sister to be a martyr for the cause of Protestantism, to take on her mantle. Reportedly, Guildford requested a final meeting with his wife, but Jane refused. She replied that meeting would only increase their misery and pain, and that it was better to wait, as they would shortly meet elsewhere and live bound by indissoluble ties. At around 10 the next morning, Jane looked from her window to see Guildford being led to the scaffold. He stopped at the main gate to ask those present to pray for him, but no priest was present as he made his way up the steps to his end. It suggests he had refused one, instead simply saying his own prayers before he laid flat on the block, the executioner removing his head cleanly with one blow. Guildford was as much a martyr as Jane, even if he was not to be as famous. His body and head were taken to the Tower's chapel as Jane emerged from Partridge's house to face her own death. She wore the same deeply black gown she had worn on the day of her trial, a prayer book open in her hands as she read to herself. 2 of her companion ladies were with her, Mistress Allen and Mistress Tilney, who wept furiously as they walked behind her. It was, after all, a tragedy. 2 young people were to be cut down before their lives had even really begun, all because of a plan orchestrated by others who were older and greedier, many of whom were now free. Climbing the same scaffold Guildford had been on just a while earlier, Jane turned to face the crowd, addressing them. "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to do the same. I do wash my hands thereof in innocence before God and the face of you, good Christian people, this day." She added, "that I die a true Christian woman, and that I look to be saved by none other means, but only by the mercy of God." Jane requested that the good people present not pray for her once she was gone, as Catholics did, but to join her in prayer while still alive. There was a flicker of uncertainty as she turned to Feckenham to ask if she could read a psalm, to which he gave his consent. She knelt to recite it, and upon standing, gave her gloves and handkerchief to her ladies. She looked down and saw the thick beam of wood that would serve as the place to put her neck, and she asked, "I pray you dispatch me quickly." Suddenly afraid this would mean the blow could come before she was ready, she added, "Will you take my head before I lay me down?" "No, madam," the executioner assured her. Jane placed a blindfold around her eyes, but then panicked as she realised she couldn't find the block without seeing it. "What shall I do? Where is it?" For a second, Jane, the confident, opinionated teenager, the brave martyr, the potential queen, was swept away as everyone saw the scared, innocent child underneath. Someone quickly helped her by guiding her to the block gently. Jane laid her head on the block and uttered her last words. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." There was a single blow of the axe, a spray of blood, and Lady Jane Grey was dead. She had been a highly intelligent and academic young girl with a world of potential ahead of her. She had also been a fearless and faithful adherent to Protestantism, becoming a martyr in the Tower that would be legendary for centuries to come. Jane had been a queen, taking on her role with composure and strength beyond her years. Jane had also been the victim of greedy nobles who saw what they wanted through using her as a pawn, a victim of her parents' desire for their eldest clever daughter to reach the highest echelons of society. But here it ended, and Lady Jane Grey would now live on only as a legend to be shaped to fit other histories. But it wasn't the end for the Grey family. They were a family in mourning, and soon Henry Grey would also lose his head. But the story wasn't over for Lady Catherine and Lady Mary. It was the aftermath of a horrific and bloody execution. That of Lady Jane Grey, and just moments before her young husband Guildford Dudley. But despite this tragedy, it wasn't the end of the story for the Grey family. Her sisters Lady Catherine and Lady Mary had to go on living through the fallout and survive the consequences. New gallows were built at all the gates to London, ready to hang traitors to the crown who had been involved in Wyatt's rebellion. Sadly for Catherine and Mary, amongst the rebels was their own father, Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk. It must have been hard for their mother Frances. She had lost her eldest daughter, was about to lose her husband, and would have to navigate what came afterwards, keeping her two remaining daughters safe. On the 17th of February 1554, just 5 days after Jane's death, Henry was led to his trial at Westminster Hall. The charge was high treason for inciting war, for opposing Mary's upcoming marriage to Philip II of Spain, and for attempting a plan which would have meant Mary's death, although the rebels had only ever planned to capture Mary and put her in the Tower of London. He apparently took his sentence cheerfully, denying the charge and stating he was not guilty, as he was merely a peer who had tried to defend his country from strangers, a 16th century term for anyone born outside England. But it didn't wash with the judges, who were well aware of Henry Grey's vehement Protestantism and knew this was the real reason behind his actions. But despite how dark everything looked, several rebels held prisoner were pardoned by the Crown just a few days earlier. There might, perhaps, be a chance for Henry to be pardoned for a second time. Mary had failed to save Jane with a conversion to Catholicism, and she was determined not to make the same mistake this time. On the evening of the 22nd of February, the night before his execution, she sent 2 of her priests to see Henry, hoping to convert him and so allow him a pardon. But Henry was as steadfast as his daughter had been, and he wasn't moved by their religious arguments. Frances will have already known Henry's fate was sealed, and she had to focus her efforts on her children. Bradgate House was returned to the Crown, along with Henry Grey's lands, leaving Frances destitute with 2 surviving daughters. She and Queen Mary still had the bond of being cousins, and Frances used this to petition Mary to at least forgive Suffolk publicly, even if she would not pardon him and save his life. This would mean later the possibility of some of the lands being returned and being allowed back at court one day, but it must have been difficult. Despite being family and having once been close, Mary had ordered the death of her daughter. Even if in the context of the day the Queen's will was law, it likely wouldn't have dampened a mother's grief. The next morning, at 9 o'clock, Henry found himself being led along the same doomed path as his daughter had walked a few days earlier, to the scaffold. One of Queen Mary's chaplains was sent to go with him, but as they approached the scaffold he began to give a sermon attacking Protestant beliefs. It would seem Mary's heart had changed from her recently given proclamation stating people should worship as they saw best, and the path forward was to return England to the papacy of Rome. Henry Grey was so infuriated by this speech that when the chaplain went to follow him up the stairs to the scaffold, he pushed him back and the 2 men fell into a tussle at the base of the steps. It only stopped when the chaplain shouted that it was the Queen's wish that he be present. Once at the top of the scaffold, Henry Grey turned to face the crowd across the railing, regaining his dignity. He started, "Masters, I have offended the Queen and her laws, and am justly condemned to die." He then begged Queen Mary's forgiveness and was told she had already given it and was praying for him. Henry knelt and prayed before rising and handing his cap and scarf to the executioner. Giving his forgiveness to the executioner when asked for it, Henry added, "And when thou dost thine office, I pray thee do it well, and bring me out of this world quickly, and God have mercy to thee." It would seem Henry Grey had accepted his fate, as his daughter Jane had. He laid his head on the block, and he died with a single blow. It would appear the gloves were now off for Queen Mary, and she took no chances. More executions were lined up for those who had been involved with the Greys, or who had once helped plot with Thomas Seymour for Elizabeth's hand in marriage. The young Princess Elizabeth herself was brought to the Tower of London to become its latest royal prisoner. Although her rooms were lavish, they were also a reminder of her mother's death. Anne Boleyn had spent her final days in the Tower, and it must have crossed Elizabeth's mind that it might be her fate also. Frances Grey and her remaining daughters, Katherine and Mary, now had to tread a very careful line. Despite Jane's martyrdom, and her plea to Katherine in her final letter to take on the cause of Protestantism, it would have meant certain death. Instead, Frances told her girls to be publicly Catholic. We have no proof of how they felt in private, but it would make sense that even if they were deeply Protestant, at least seeming to have converted to Catholicism was a necessary survival mechanism. They would not have been alone, and Frances had lost enough family. Jane's legacy did live on, however, through the letter she had written to the family's former tutor Thomas Harding, and the letter to her sister Katherine, by becoming widely distributed throughout the kingdom. It was a dangerous assault on Queen Mary's reign, and it was best for Frances, Katherine and Mary Grey to keep their heads down. But Frances's earlier attempts at softening Mary's feelings towards them did work, as in April she was re-granted some of the estates Henry Grey had held, including Bow Manor near Bradgate. and just a few months later, she and her daughters were once again permitted to be at court. Now part of the Queen's privy chamber and appearing to be Catholic, their future seemed to be safe, for now. Court life would have been very routine. Queen Mary liked her ladies to be dressed and ready for duties by 9 in the morning, meals were at noon and in the evening, and the rest of the day would be spent finessing the skills required of a noble lady, singing, dancing, sewing, reading and playing games such as cards. Sundays were the only change to the routine in that it was the day Queen Mary and her retinue of ladies went to the royal chapel to hear petitions from the people. Lady Katherine might well have been wary in this new life, with Jane's letter reminding her of her duty to Protestantism lingering in her mind. But she was, nevertheless, a young noblewoman, and Catherine's thoughts probably dwelt more on marriage than piety. But the marriage that would have been uppermost in most people's thoughts was that of Queen Mary herself. On the 20th of July, her betrothed, Philip of Spain, arrived on England's shores. It was a marriage that Mary was delighted with. Philip, less so. She was gaining a husband, something that had been held from her for far longer than it should have, and a chance to create an heir for her kingdom. He was young, handsome, and making the best of a situation which left him with no power in England. Mary, by contrast, was a decade older and seemed older still, her face lined with the anxiety life had put upon her, despite the rich gowns of crimson velvet and damask she adorned herself with. The wedding took place at Winchester Cathedral on the 25th of July, 1554, a suitably grand affair, the entire cathedral covered in cloth of gold. Mary herself sparkled, clothed in gold trimmed with diamonds, and a white satin kirtle embroidered with silver and more gold. Philip complimented her in white leather and silver embroidery, his Castilian jewels glittering alongside the collar of the garter he had been given when arriving in England, a public symbol, perhaps, of his now loyalty to both countries. The beginning of Mary and Philip's reign together was marked by entertainments and masks, and physical competitions between the young noblemen, such as jousting. All seemed well. In the wake of this merriment, however, came Queen Mary's revival of her father's old heresy laws. Many around her advised against it, but she was so fearful of the threat to her religion and her Protestant subjects who might wish to overthrow her, that soon after, the horrific burnings which became synonymous with her rule began. Although the punishments were originally intended only for heretic priests, it soon spread to ordinary people who were not willing to hide their religious beliefs. Katherine, along with other members of her family, maintained links with other families who had to hide their Protestantism. She struck up a friendship with Lady Jane Seymour, the daughter of the elder Edward Seymour, the protector of England during Edward's reign. This friendship would lead to other relationships, most notably that of Jane Seymour's brother, the 19-year-old Edward Seymour. Katherine herself was now 18 and the beauty of her family. Although she had the same opportunities for education as Jane had had, Katherine had been less interested in refining her mind. Blonde, blue-eyed and slim, she fitted the 16th century version of beauty perfectly, and Edward Seymour was just as interested in her as she was in him. He himself had inherited his mother's good looks, but the possible union between Katherine and Edward went beyond being a handsome couple. Through his mother, Edward Seymour was descended from Edward III, a fact that by itself did not make his claim any stronger, but it would strengthen Katherine's. And if the two were married and had a son together, it would seriously have rivaled the Princess Elizabeth's claim to the throne. That summer, Edward Seymour seems to have asked his sister about brokering the idea of marriage to Katherine. His mother, also trying to keep her head under the radar after the misfortune to her family, had no intention of encouraging the dangerous match and was horrified. She tried to talk her son out of it, but Edward was stubborn and ignored his mother's advice. But soon, the status quo was to change. In October 1558, just 5 years after she had finally won her crown, Mary I fell deeply ill with influenza. It was clear she would not live for long. Before she went, she had been somewhat forced to name her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, as her successor. After Mass on the 17th of November, England's first crowned queen, Mary I, died. She left behind her a new legacy, one of queenship in a queen's own stead. Much like Jane Grey had planned to, Mary had relegated her husband to the status of consort, allowing him no real powers over England. However, her connection through him to Spain had dragged many of England's youth into fighting Spain's wars across the sea. As Elizabeth stepped into her sister's shadow, it must have been a reminder that any husband she chose would have some interest in the civic affairs of her state, that everything down to his religion could create war or peace. On the 13th of December, a grand ceremony marked the final passage of Mary I's body as it was conveyed to her final resting place at Westminster Abbey. Katherine was no doubt amongst those in the procession behind the carved image of the Queen that graced the chariot carrying the coffin, all present dressed in deepest black. After the funeral rites were done and Mary I's body laid to rest, it was time for a new era. Elizabeth I was to make her entry into London to await her coronation. For the coronation itself, Frances and Mary Grey were not invited. Frances possibly because of her ill health. Catherine Grey was invited, but Elizabeth had not forgotten her distant cousin was sister to a dead usurper, and instead of being in the Privy Chamber, Catherine was pushed down to the Presence Chamber, to which all the upper nobility could be present. It was a cold, snowy day when Elizabeth made her way into London. Catherine was present for this, but she would have been very much aware of her lowered position. The Greys, it seemed, were to be pushed quietly into the shadows for the time being, next in line or not. But the procession of which she was a small part was a grand sight. The important men of the city, the aldermen, knights, lords, archbishops and servants for all of them led the way to the sound of trumpeters announcing Elizabeth's imminent entry. The new queen followed them on a litter, covered in cloth of gold lined with pink satin. Her hair was loose about her shoulders over a mantle of cloth of silver, a symbol of chastity and regality, suitable for a young unmarried queen. It was clear that already Elizabeth understood the power of a fabulous display to wow the crowds into being on her side. Following the queen was her favourite, Robert Dudley. Despite the baggage attached to his family name, Elizabeth seemed to favour the young, handsome noble with dark curling hair and a trim figure. As soon as Elizabeth's coronation was over, the question of her marriage came immediately. She pushed back at her advisers, making it clear she was not considering it for the immediate future. She was, after all, rumoured to be in love with Robert Dudley, who was already married. This triggered rumours she could not have children, and eyes once again fell on Catherine Grey. If she were to marry and have a child, it would make it very precarious for Elizabeth, who was well aware of this. The Queen reacted by ignoring Catherine and snubbing her. Courtiers around Elizabeth who wanted her favour had to show interest in only who she liked, and so Catherine was pushed further back into the shadows of court. She confided in the Count of Ferrier, the Spanish ambassador sent by Philip II, that Elizabeth did not wish her to succeed, and that she was frustrated and angry at this. Whispers at court told of Catherine openly losing her temper with her cousin in the presence chamber, public family rows for all to see. Katherine was in a position dangerously close to that of her dead sister, the next in line for the crown, but becoming more disliked by the moment. While Elizabeth I remained unmarried and without an heir, no matter how much she snubbed her, Catherine Grey, as her closest relative and Protestant, was her expected successor. This was about to be proven in a scheme created by Philip II of Spain himself. Having now returned to Spain, Philip could see how he could use this to his advantage. Queen Elizabeth had ended England's aid in fighting France, and if she instead arranged an alliance with Henri II, the French king, it would be dangerous for Spain's holdings in the Netherlands. Spain needed to remain on friendly terms with England, but a marriage alliance had been turned down flat by Elizabeth, on the grounds Philip had been married to her sister. But a marriage alliance wasn't entirely out of the question. But to whom? After her confessions to Ferrier, the ambassador had decided that Catherine Grey was the perfect candidate, with her royal connections, English stability, and being turned against the Queen by Elizabeth's own actions. Ferrier himself deeply disliked and distrusted Elizabeth. She was as Protestant as Mary had been Catholic, and Catherine informed Ferrier that she was Catholic through and through. Catherine convinced Ferrier that her family hated her for the choice of remaining Catholic. How true this might have been is difficult to tell. The Greys' early lives had been marked by their steadfast adherence to the new faith, but since then they had declared themselves Catholic and now flipped back, except for Catherine, it seems, to being Protestant. This could have been genuine, or this could have been politically smart. The reason for Catherine's declaration to the Spanish ambassador was linked to matters of the heart. Edward Seymour had cooled towards her in recent months, and perhaps Catherine saw an opportunity to make him jealous, as teenage girls might even then. Ferrier promised her he could perhaps set up a marriage through the aid of his king, maybe to a Habsburg relative, and in return Catherine swore she would not marry without Ferrier's knowledge. It is possible that Catherine, being young and lacking her sister's sharpness, thought this was little more than talk, but in Spain the information fed back was taken seriously, and plans were made to kidnap the young girl and marry her to Spain's advantage. A small number of ships would make their way up the Thames, and Catherine would be smuggled on board one of them, being made off with to Spanish shores. However, before anything could come of these plans, the French king Henri II died from a horrific jousting accident, a splinter from a lance entering his eyeball up to his temple. Philip II paused, his plans on hold, as Henri's heir, the weaker Francis II, came to the French throne. It was now unlikely that France would invade England, and risking Elizabeth's wrath over a marriage no longer seemed like a sensible option. The kidnapping plan was abandoned quietly. Catherine Grey, of course, having thought it little more than a game, had no idea of anything that had been planned for her future in Spain. She was with the rest of the court as Queen Elizabeth made her way around her palaces, pausing at Eltham, a royal palace near Greenwich. There, Catherine finally met once again with Edward Seymour, who appeared to have resisted his mother's warnings, and once again the two of them were in each other's company. The pair later said this was the summer in which they fell deeply, passionately in love with each other. The following year, in October 1559, Edward Seymour finally made his intentions plain to Catherine's mother Frances. Frances had remarried in 1555 herself, making a safe match not to a nobleman, but to her master of the horse, Adrian Stokes. It was a love match, but it offered her family safety as it removed her from the English crown's line of succession. Although a marriage between Edward and Catherine would have been risky, Frances had been ill for some time, and was only getting worse. No doubt before she died, she wanted to see her eldest remaining child happily married, and she liked Edward Seymour. However, unfortunately for the family, their opinion was not the only one that mattered. Queen Elizabeth had the final say on whom her courtiers married, especially those she was related to, for the obvious reason that it could change everything in the line to the throne. At this time, Catherine strengthening her position would not have been seen by many as a threat to Elizabeth, but as a counterpoint, as Elizabeth's Protestant heir against Mary, Queen of Scots, a combination of everything England rebuked at that time, Scottish, French, and Catholic. But Elizabeth was not one of them. Nevertheless, Adrian helped his wife draw up a letter to Elizabeth, in which she begged the Queen to allow the happy union of her daughter and Edward Seymour, stating it was the only thing that she desired before her death, and should be an occasion to her to die the more quietly. First, however, Frances had to speak to Catherine about the marriage and ascertain it was really what her daughter wanted. Catherine's response was that she was very willing to marry her beloved, but the news soon turned cold. Seymour had been advised by friends to put off asking the Queen about the marriage while she was being courted by Prince Eric, the heir to the Swedish throne. Instead, he set about making friends with Eric's brother, the Duke of Finland, in case it proved useful. In the time the young couple waited, Frances Grey grew ever more ill, and it became clear she didn't have much time left. On the 20th of November, surrounded by her daughters, husband, and close friends, Frances passed quietly away at her home. Queen Elizabeth, grateful at Frances's careful second marriage that had never threatened her position, immediately offered to take on the expenses of the funeral. Frances was buried with a procession and banners befitting her royal lineage at St. Edmund's Chapel in Westminster Abbey. Catherine was chief mourner for her mother, following behind her mother's coffin with a great black train behind her dress. As well as grieving for the loss of her mother, she must have been wondering what she would do without her mother's protective common sense and advice. After her mother's death, it would seem Elizabeth I had a change of heart about how she treated Catherine. Perhaps her cousin's death had reminded her that blood was thicker than water, or perhaps it was simply a shrewd move to keep a close eye on the young woman. Catherine was promoted to wait on Elizabeth personally, and rumours abounded at court that the Queen was considering adopting her in order to smooth Catherine's path as her heir. For the time being, everything seemed to have turned itself around. Catherine Grey had gone from being the daughter of an executed traitor to a Catholic lady-in-waiting to a Protestant heir-to-be. Elizabeth seemed to finally be showing her young cousin favour, and young love blossomed between Catherine and Edward Seymour. But if Catherine felt secure in her future, it was all about to fall apart in spectacular fashion, and once again, the Grey family's name would be dragged through the mud. Lady Catherine Grey, the unfortunate sister of the late Lady Jane Grey, was enjoying her life at court. She had been in a tenuous position since Queen Elizabeth had taken the throne, being both pushed aside and a potential heir. But in the wake of her mother's death, Elizabeth seemed to have taken Catherine once more into her fold, for now. Rumours flew around court that Queen Elizabeth was considering adopting Catherine as her heir, although in truth, Elizabeth preferred her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary might have been Catholic and foreign, but she was still dynastically closer to Elizabeth's royal line than a distant granddaughter of the younger sister to Henry VIII. This was more important to Elizabeth than any other consideration, but her Secretary of State, William Cecil, preferred to focus on religious and English-born concerns for the heir to the throne. The two butted heads on this matter, and while he was away in Scotland in 1560, taking charge of a campaign against the French aiding Mary Stuart, Robert Dudley took advantage. Seeing a way to get in more with the Queen, he sided with Elizabeth and ran Cecil down, the pair now going out hunting together every morning. For Katherine and Edward Seymour, this was of little interest, except that Elizabeth was distracted from their own affair. Before Katherine's mother had died, the plans for Katherine and Edward had never been put into place. However, they continued to see one another romantically. Lady Jane Seymour, Edward's sister, and Henry Seymour, his brother, helped to pass messages and tokens of affection between the two. More people around them knew what was going on now, but it was Elizabeth's tryst that had caught the attention of the public gossips. Although she had been warned not to fan the flames of gossip and that she would be seen as immoral, Elizabeth was now the centre of scandalous rumours that she was involved in a sexual affair with Robert Dudley. Some people even claimed she was pregnant. All the court was furious with Dudley at ruining Elizabeth's chances at a good marriage, and a man called Drury was imprisoned for plotting the nobleman's assassination. Some thought Dudley would not live to see out the year. Elizabeth, however, refused to give up spending time with her favourite, and William Cecil fell further out of favour over his disapproval. Spain once again began to wonder about a marriage between Katherine and a Habsburg. Worried about Spain's interest, Cecil told the Spanish ambassador, Bishop Alvarez de Cuandra, that the Privy Council would not find another woman acceptable to rule if anything happened to Elizabeth. In truth, they would have been fine with it, depending on who that woman was married to. Some in the Privy Council thought Katherine should be married to the Earl of Arran, leader of the Scottish Protestants and Mary, Queen of Scots' cousin. However, her romance with Edward Seymour was also considered suitable. He was descended from Edward III. By September 1560, Cecil was rapidly losing patience with Elizabeth's affair, but it was about to get worse. Robert Dudley's wife, Amy, was found dead. She was found at the base of a staircase at Cunmore Place, only 28 years old. The coroner's judgment was that of misfortune, but as it had happened at the home of one of Dudley's friends, Sir Richard Verney, and she had only fallen 8 steps, hardly enough to break a neck, surely. Add in the fact that Dudley's relationship with Elizabeth was so public, and almost everyone suspected foul play. Aware of the destruction her continued relationship with him would cause, Elizabeth promised William Cecil she would not marry Robert Dudley, but she was tormented by the decision. And importantly, once again, Edward Seymour was advised to hold for a while on his own marriage plans. Katherine was distraught. Not knowing that Edward had been advised to wait until things improved at court, she couldn't understand his sudden coolness towards her. When she heard rumours of him flirting with other ladies at court, she sent him a furiously worded letter, and the young Earl of Hertford panicked. Edward didn't want to lose Katherine, and there would likely be plenty of others who would take his place if he didn't make a serious move. His sister, Lady Jane Seymour, took a letter from him to Katherine at court. Within, he professed his undying love and again proposed marriage, but this time with a slight change of plan. He suggested that to avoid all such suspicions, he would, if she would, marry her out of hand, even as soon as the Queen's Majesty should next come to London. Edward was now, it seemed, in a hurry. They met secretly at Jane's private chambers at court, made a formal betrothal to one another, and Edward gave Katherine a pointed diamond ring, which she kept until she died. The pair decided to marry as soon as the Queen had left the palace. Hasty enough would have been getting betrothed without asking Elizabeth's permission, but to marry without her knowledge was courting danger. When the couple heard news that Elizabeth had left Whitehall for Eltham to hunt for a few days, they wasted no time. Feigning toothache, Katherine was given permission to stay behind with Jane Seymour as her companion. She left immediately for Edward's house on Cannon Row, where he was anxiously awaiting her arrival. Well aware of the trouble they would be in if discovered, Edward told his servants to have the day off, making sure they had left the house for the day. As Katherine arrived, Jane was sent to quickly fetch the priest, one of the many Protestant exiles who were now coming home after Queen Mary's death. He was nearby, and the ceremony was quickly set up in Edward's bedroom. The priest stood by the bedroom window, asked if they were free to marry. Receiving the answer that they were, the ceremony proceeded, and after a quick exchange of vows and a gold ring made of 5 inscribed links, Katherine and Edward were pronounced husband and wife. There was no turning back now. The priest was given a hefty tip of £10 by Jane, who had witnessed the wedding. Apparently, she made her excuses and left, as it became clear the young bride and groom wanted to go to bed. According to later testimonies, the couple then undressed in the same room they had been wedded, spending the next few hours together in bed, and only parting when Katherine had to leave for a dinner appointment at court. The newlyweds couldn't keep their hands off each other, sneaking off to rendezvous in the London palaces, Katherine's chambers, and Edward's home on Cannon Row. However, they still had to keep their marriage a secret from the Queen, and as a result, they didn't live together or even spend the night together. Although most of the court had some idea they were romantically involved, despite their impassioned denials, no one but Jane and various servants knew about their marriage. William Cecil, among those in the dark, was still worried about the relationship between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley, and those worries included Katherine. If Elizabeth wavered and married Dudley, Catherine Grey had to be the possible backup plan. To ensure Katherine was protected, Edward Seymour was persuaded to take a trip around the royal courts of Europe. No one, of course, even bothered to tell Katherine. Katherine finally learned about these plans, not from her husband, but from her sister-in-law Jane. Worried that she had fallen pregnant, Katherine asked Jane for advice, who told her there was no choice now but to tell Elizabeth, to which Edward also agreed. While hoping for the Queen's mercy was probably the best course of action at this point, Katherine did not agree and refused to tell the Queen. And sadly, just a few months later, Katherine's closest friend and confidant, Jane Seymour, passed away from an illness. She died at the end of March, still a teenager. Katherine and Edward now only had each other, and the only witness to their union had died. It was time for Edward to leave on his trip around Europe, but he repeatedly asked his new wife if she was with child or not. Uncertain and unable to speak to any woman around her who would have been sure, Katherine was only able to reply that she was unsure. Edward, pressured to leave on his trip, wrote a will, leaving lands to Katherine of £1,000 a year, as well as some cash to use on hand. He promised that, if she was having their baby, he would not tarry long from her. As he left, William Cecil reminded Katherine that developing a friendship with Edward Seymour without the Queen's knowledge was dangerous, something she would later say she wished he had stated more firmly before her marriage. While Edward went off to educate himself on the royal matters of Europe, Katherine bore her secret pregnancy by herself. In the 8th month of her pregnancy, she was still somehow hiding her condition, but she was fully aware she was soon to have a child as she felt it moving. She sent letters to Edward in France, but received no reply. Perhaps they were simply not reaching him as he moved between palaces. Perhaps he had abandoned her. She had no way of knowing. There was no one to confide in. Katherine was a young woman with no proof of her marriage. a baby whose father seemed to have abandoned it, and the Queen's wrath to deal with when it would come, inevitably, out. The young woman must have been terrified, with no one to comfort her or help her out of her situation. Katherine, therefore, became desperate. She attempted to reignite her previous marriage with Henry Herbert, but when he heard rumours of her pregnancy, he quickly backed out. He sent her several threatening letters, promising to expose her if she didn't return portraits and trinkets he had sent previously. By this time, Katherine and the other ladies of the Privy Chamber had set off with Elizabeth as she spent the summer visiting palaces and manor houses around the country. It was a hot and sticky summer, filled with rolling storms. As they entered Ipswich on the 9th of August, a deeply Protestant town, Queen Elizabeth lost her famous temper at the sight of married priests, many of them not wearing the correct garb. Although the Queen was billed as a Protestant, in truth, she enjoyed many elements of Catholicism, and it was only those advisers around her who ensured the Protestant religion remained as it did. It was a bad time for the Queen to find out Katherine was pregnant, but that was exactly what was about to happen. That night, Katherine broke down and told one of her friends, Mistress Sentlow, everything. Her secretive marriage, her growing child, and the fact the Queen knew nothing. Sentlow herself wept, saying she was very sorry she had done so without the consent or knowledge of the Queen's Majesty or any other of her friends. The next day in church, Katherine heard whispers in the pews and realised with horror news of her situation was out. The poor girl must have felt sick when she realised she had to face the Queen and reveal the truth, and she had to do so alone, with still no response from her new husband. So she decided she needed someone to help on her behalf, and Katherine decided Robert Dudley should be that someone. Although they had never got on well, he was still her brother-in-law through her deceased sister. She quietly slipped into his chambers and begged him to intercede on her behalf with the Queen. Robert agreed, possibly thinking it would urge Elizabeth to marry him. It did not go well. The Queen was furious. Catherine Grey was taken to the Tower of London to be interrogated, and word was sent to retrieve Edward Seymour from abroad. Elizabeth, ever paranoid about those around her, suspected a plot. She wasn't alone. Mistress Sentlow was also taken for questioning, along with the names of those who had ever been involved with the Grey family floating around in rumours. Everyone thought there had to be more to the story than just young love. But who and how were the questions? It just didn't make sense that Catherine Grey, a possible heir to the throne of a childless queen, and therefore the most powerful political pawn there was at court, had simply married Seymour in a giddy act of teenage passion. On the 22nd of August, Catherine's questioning began. She gave little information though, proving to be as tenaciously stubborn as her sister Jane had been. Katherine was now 9 months pregnant. Edward, at the same time, had suspected he was in trouble when a message came from one of his servants stating what had happened to his wife. Despite those around him who put in a good word with Elizabeth, Edward was still arrested on his return and also incarcerated in the Tower. Unable to see his wife and comfort her, he sent Catherine flowers and begged his jailers to find out how she was from her servants. The pair also had to get their stories straight, something that proved difficult. Edward swore that Adrian Stokes, the former husband of Frances, Catherine's mother, had known nothing about the marriage. Adrian, however, when questioned, admitted he had known everything, and Catherine claimed she had lost the will given to her by Edward. Whether this was true or not is still unknown, but whatever the truth, its loss, along with their only witness no longer living, meant that Catherine and Edward could not prove their marriage. But on the 21st of September, in the afternoon, Catherine Grey finally gave birth to her and Edward's first child, a boy, Edward Seymour, Viscount Beauchamp. His father, the elder Edward Seymour, was unable to see his son, but he marked the occasion in a French Bible, scribbling his son's name and date of birth on the first page. 2 days later, the younger Edward was baptized in the small chapel on the Tower grounds, but apparently without a priest. Elizabeth forbid it. It must not have escaped Catherine's attention in her current predicament that she was stood mere meters away from her sister's and father's remains, a reminder of how high someone could fall. All hell broke loose that winter. The subject of Robert Dudley's dead wife, Amy, came up once more, and he fell out with the Earl of Arundel, who was now determined to find out the truth of it and indict Dudley. William Cecil, who was somehow now thought to have been involved with the marriage between Catherine and Edward, was trying to repair the relationship between himself and Robert Dudley. Dudley was important to the Queen and could help repair the issues now building due to Catherine's son. Her son was hugely important for the security of the realm and the religion of the realm. Not only was there a chance to pass on the throne of England to a Protestant heir, but to a male one, still infinitely preferable in the male-dominated world of Elizabethan politics. Elizabeth's fury knew no bounds, and it was rumoured she was looking for any way to have the child declared illegitimate. Inside the Tower, Catherine was recovering with her infant son. He was healthy and robust. She had comfortable rooms. Her pet dogs and monkeys were with her, and her husband was only a few feet down the hall from her. The deputy of the Tower even allowed messages to be passed between the two of them. She was unaware of the furore outside the Tower. Devout Protestants within the court had been outraged that Elizabeth had refused to exclude Mary, Queen of Scots, from the succession, and here was a chance to have a male Protestant from 2 royal lines declared as Elizabeth's legal heir. There was a huge push to make Elizabeth agree and to free the young couple from the Tower. Robert Dudley was declared the Christmas Prince of the Inner Temple Law School within London, and prominent members of nobility and gentry were involved in this, and the subsequent plays put on for entertainment during the Yuletide feast. They pushed the message of how a country could fall into civil war if the ruler did not declare an English heir, and one even suggested that Catherine Grey be named Elizabeth's heir until the Queen had children. These plays were then performed at court, and a famous miniature of Catherine and her son Edward dates from this time. However, the propaganda being thrown at Elizabeth was completely ignored by her. Sadly, she was about to get her wish in declaring the younger Edward Seymour illegitimate. Catherine and the elder Edward's marriage had been unconventional, but most could look past the small things that never happened, as the Book of Common Prayer suggested. The banns read 3 Sundays before the marriage, giving the bride away, or the taking of communion. However, what couldn't be ignored was the lack of witnesses. Although both bride and groom had given consent, Jane Seymour was no longer there to acknowledge this, and the priest who had married them had disappeared somewhere into a country village. Their marriage was declared invalid. Those who had been fighting Catherine's cause were angry at Robert Dudley for doing nothing, but some of them got their revenge. William Cecil had secretly been gathering evidence through spies on the Spanish ambassador's opinion on Dudley and how Elizabeth behaved with him. It showed her up as a foolish woman chasing love instead of concentrating on her kingdom, and for the first time, Elizabeth realised she could never marry Robert Dudley, and she needed to publicly state what her intentions for the succession were. She set about trying to rebuild trust with her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, and a meeting was arranged between them for September 1562. It looked as though the two women might renew the ties between Scotland and England, leaving Catherine and Edward Seymour out in the cold. Katherine and Edward, however, their firstborn son now a year old, were not going to sit down and take this lightly. They were determined to appeal, and Edward Seymour had even bribed 2 guards in the tower to allow him to visit his wife on at least 2 occasions in May. Being young and passionately infatuated with each other, the couple spent the hour they had each visit sharing their bed once more. On the 3rd time Edward tried to visit, however, the guards had changed their minds and found the door locked. But Katherine could speak through her door, and she informed her husband that she believed she was pregnant a 2nd time. Edward Seymour was overjoyed. Not only was this another child with the woman he loved, it was a chance for their family to be declared legitimate. They had declared their marriage before the Archbishop of Canterbury during their questioning, and the whole court now knew of it. Their 2nd son could not be anything but legitimate, and an appeal for the younger Edward's status would surely follow. Equally, the possible friendship between Queen Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots was demolished in the face of war in France. News reached England of a massacre in which several French Protestants had been murdered under the orders of Mary's own uncle. The Scottish Queen immediately wrote a letter to her cousin claiming she had no part in it, but the damage was done. Their meeting was postponed to the next year, and so there was to be no political alliance between their kingdoms, and pressure mounted to name Katherine as the heir to the throne in the wake of deadly illness. Elizabeth fell ill on the 10th of October, 1562. It was clear, as she became more delirious and feverish, that this was the dreaded and often fatal smallpox. A week later, Elizabeth fell unconscious, and the Privy Chamber descended into anxious chaos on what to do for the succession of the crown. Some wanted Catherine Grey to be named as heir, following the will of Henry VIII. Some wanted the Earl of Huntingdon, Henry Hastings, but he had little royal blood. Others still favoured Mary Queen of Scots, or her English aunt, Margaret Douglas, the Countess of Lennox. It was a mess, and one made worse when Elizabeth briefly woke up, weakly stating that it was her wish Robert Dudley be made Lord Protector, swearing she had always loved him, but that nothing improper had passed between them. The Privy Council agreed publicly, but had no intention of following through on this. Finally, Elizabeth broke through the worst of her illness, and she gradually got better, recovering fully from the disease. But Parliament was more nervous than ever about who would follow her if she died. She needed to encourage a male heir, but she had no intention of changing her mind about Catherine Grey's son. She turned her attention to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, son of the Countess of Lennox. He was, like his mother, Catholic, but he was also Mary Queen of Scots' cousin and had been born in England. A marriage between them could unite England and Scotland. When Parliament was opened in January 1563, a petition to the Queen was read out, with Parliament humbly requesting she marry, but also that she name her heir. It was at this meeting of her councillors she also found out that Catherine Grey was pregnant once more, now 8 months into her pregnancy. Elizabeth was having her hand forced, and she fought viciously against it, immediately locking up the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Edward Warner, for his lapse in security between the couple. But many nobles and the public were ecstatic at the news, and many called for them to be set free, asking why a man and wife shouldn't be together. And nothing could stop the birth of Catherine and Edward's second son on the 10th of February, 1563, and the young Thomas Seymour came into the world. He was born in the Tower as his elder 18-month-old brother had been, and a few days later he was christened in the same chapel. Later that day, his father, the elder Edward Seymour, was dragged away to Star Chamber to find out his punishment. He was charged with having his first child with Catherine as a kinswoman of the Queen, then with having his second son with Catherine and bribing the Tower guards. Finally, he was charged with breaching his imprisonment. Altogether, he was fined £15,000, over £5.2 million in today's money, and sent back to be jailed at the Queen's pleasure. However, Edward Seymour knew there were many powerful people on their side, and was certain he could get his family freed from the Tower, even now. In the summer of that year, the plague broke out, its terrifying presence looming over London. Elizabeth and her court were moved to Windsor, but Catherine and Edward remained in the Tower of London, unable to do anything but wait for the deadly disease to come to them. Those on their side petitioned the Queen to allow them to be taken from the Tower, and finally Elizabeth relented, but they were still prisoners. Edward Seymour and his eldest son, the younger Edward, were under house arrest with his mother, the Duchess of Somerset, Anne Seymour. Meanwhile, Catherine and their younger son Thomas were to be sent away from them to the house of her uncle, Lord John Grey. She arrived at Pergo in Essex on the 3rd of September and immediately set about writing a letter to William Cecil, thanking him for his part in saving her family from the plague, asking him to continue to petition the Queen for her forgiveness, which, with upstretched hands and downbent knees, from the bottom of my heart, most humbly I crave. Although she attempted to make the best of her situation, dressing and playing with her youngest son, Catherine soon sank into a deep depression. She ate very little, soon becoming so ill that her uncle, Lord John Grey, was worried about her. He wrote to his friend William Cecil, explaining his worry and asking for advice. In return, Cecil suggested Catherine petition Elizabeth once more, offering choice phrases, and to read over it in draft form first. Then it would be given to Dudley to deliver it, the only man Elizabeth would not punish. It was sent just a few weeks later to the Queen. Catherine begged deeply for forgiveness, while also stating that her marriage was just, but in no way had been committed to anger the Queen. She wrote that she wished to crave pardon for my most disobedient and rash matching of myself, without your Highness's consent. However, whatever hopes Catherine may have had were dashed quickly. The Queen was not to be moved, and Catherine told those around her she was so miserable she would rather be dead. But the situation was to change once more. Elizabeth had found out about attempts made in Europe to seek advice on the marriage of Catherine and Edward being valid, attempts that had been successful. All that was needed was for consent of the couple to each other and consummation of the marriage afterwards. The Queen was looking for vengeance, and unfortunately Catherine's uncle, John Grey, was identified as one of those who had helped with these aims, made worse by his recent petitions to the Queen on his niece's behalf. He was cast into the Tower, and Catherine and Thomas were sent away to Sir William Petre at Ingatstone, deputy to Elizabeth's Secretary of State, and also living in Essex. Her imprisonment here lasted 2 years, until Petre became ill, and they were moved in May 1566 to Gosfield Hall, the seat of Sir John Wentworth and his wife. By this time, the younger Edward Seymour now lived alone with his paternal grandmother, as his father had been moved to the house of Sir John Mason, who hated him. But Catherine's new jailers were kindly, if elderly, well into their 70s. They worried at the security of their home, but Catherine was a quiet prisoner, only remaining steadfast in her communication with her husband, hoping soon for the Queen's forgiveness. But Elizabeth was dealing with fresh demand for her to marry and name an heir in the wake of Mary Queen of Scots having just given birth to a son, James. She was more determined than ever to quash Catherine Grey and her claim to the crown, in view of preferring the Scottish Queen Mary. But in February 1567, something dramatic was to change this. Mary's husband, Lord Darnley, had been found brutally murdered, and Mary was suspected to be part of it. This triggered a civil war in Scotland, and the suspicion of Mary's involvement ended any alliance with Elizabeth. The Dudley family, who had so far been supporters of the Scottish Queen, switched sides and promised instead to aid Edward Seymour in his attempts to free his family and legitimise his children in order to support their succession. Elizabeth was appalled and doubled the security on Edward, still hoping to reunite her cousin Mary with the Scottish throne. In September, Sir John Wentworth died, and although the Wentworths had grown fond of Katherine and Thomas, his widow was an elderly lady who was not well herself, and it was no longer suitable for Katherine to stay there. She was moved once more to Cockfield Hall, the house of Sir Owen Hopton in Suffolk. It was further from court, a reminder of her diminished status. When she arrived, Hopton was shocked at her appearance. She was thin and pale, bowed down by depression and fears she would never again see her husband or their now 6-year-old eldest son again. She knew she would never again see her sweet little boys together with her beloved Ned, as she called Edward Seymour. Her only comfort was her younger son Thomas, who remained with his mother, now 4 years old. Although she was held up as the most likely candidate for heir, it seemed Elizabeth had decided to never set Katherine free. Soon, it wouldn't matter. In early January 1568, Katherine fell ill. Hopton sent frantically for a physician, hoping to rouse her. She was eating very little and looked dreadfully thin. On the 26th of January, she told those around her she was dying, something she had perhaps wanted for a long time. As she grew faint, she asked a favour of her kindly jailer. Firstly, that he deliver a message for her concerning her husband and children. This was for the Queen, and she beseeched him to ask for her forgiveness for marrying without the Queen's consent. Katherine knew that if Elizabeth gave it, her children would not lose quite so much when she was gone. She also asked that the Queen forgive and be kind to Edward Seymour, knowing her death would hit him hard. Her second favour was that tokens be sent to Edward, 3 rings. One was the pointed diamond ring he had given her on the day they had betrothed themselves to each other. Another was her wedding ring with the 5 links, handing them both to Hopton and saying, "I pray you deliver this also unto my lord, and pray him, even as I have been unto him, a true and faithful wife, that he will be a loving and natural father unto my children." She also gave him a 3rd ring to pass on, mounted with a death's head as a reminder of mortal life, engraved with, "While I lived, yours." She then felt herself slipping away, and even as Sir Hopton ordered the maid to run to the church and ring the bells so that the villagers might pray for Lady Katherine's soul, she closed her eyes herself and died in her bed. The official statement of her death stated she had passed of tuberculosis and would explain her earlier illness, but there is a modern suggestion that she may also have purposely starved herself to death, a possible scenario in light of her depression. Her son Thomas was sent to live with his brother and paternal grandmother, the Duchess of Somerset. Elizabeth, despite the request made of a young, dying woman, never really forgave Catherine Grey. Lady Catherine was to be buried at the small Yoxford church in the village, rather than Westminster Abbey, although she was later interred with her husband at Salisbury Cathedral. Queen Elizabeth, however, could not ignore the royal bloodline of the Grey family, and Catherine was to be given a grand and solemn funeral ceremony, attended by many members of the court. Catherine's only crime had been to fall in love and make a rash decision, blinded by youth and naivety. Her punishment for that had been to never see again her beloved husband or eldest son, and to die at a young age, plagued by fears for the future of her 2 sons. But if Elizabeth thought the discussion of the Grey family being her heirs would disappear with Catherine's death, she was to be sadly mistaken, for Lady Mary Grey, the youngest of the sisters, was still waiting in the wings. While Catherine Grey was living out her imposed arrest through several different stately homes, Lady Mary Grey, the youngest of the Grey sisters, was watching from the sidelines. She was intelligent and well-read, but the idea of being the heir to the throne of England had likely never passed through her mind, even when her deceased sister Jane briefly became queen. But with the imprisonment of her remaining sister Catherine and Elizabeth I still unmarried and childless, Mary Grey found herself in just that position. But while intelligent and educated, Mary did not hold the best qualities of her older sisters. She wasn't commanding and sharply opinionated like Jane, nor was she a beauty who charmed all who knew her like her sister Catherine. From all accounts, Mary actually had a curved spine and was the shortest person at court. The Spanish ambassador bluntly stated she was crook-backed and very ugly. In Tudor society, being beautiful was a symbol of divine right and the correct social order. Aristocratic women were assumed to always be beautiful by way of their status. What the court considered ugly was an indication of sin and the opposite of what the higher ranks stood for. But this probably also allowed Mary to blend into the background, keeping her head down while Elizabeth vented her fury on Catherine. It worked, and Mary became a part of court life, appointed as a maid of honour to Elizabeth, a junior to the ladies-in-waiting. Her late mother Frances Grey had left most of her estate to her second husband Adrian Stokes, leaving Mary with only a modest annual income of £20. Elizabeth ensured she was instead granted an allowance of around £80. It was safe to say perhaps her distant cousin was feeling somewhat softened towards the remaining Grey daughter, and it looked as though Mary might get through court life unscathed. But Mary was about to attract the Queen's anger for herself. Not to be outdone in the claims for true love, she had fallen for a man at court. He was a former soldier called Thomas Keyes, who was now the sergeant porter at court, known as the tallest man there, and a widower with several children already. A sergeant porter was essentially in charge of palace security, and in order to get the position, Thomas must have proven his loyalty and dependability. He was hardly likely to be considered a suitable candidate, however, for a young woman of 19 who was descended from Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. But it's possible Mary thought she would be following in her late mother's footsteps when Frances married her master of the horse, making herself less of a threat to Elizabeth. Whatever the case, as the pair met each day at the palace gate where Thomas stood guard, they courted one another with the usual traditions. Thomas gave her several little trinkets as proof of his affections, including his ruby ring and a gold chain with a bottle of mother of pearl hanging from it. We have no way of knowing what made Mary cast her eye in Thomas's direction, but they were clearly serious about one another, and to Mary's credit, for some time she went no further. Wary of what had happened to Catherine, she would have understood she had to ask Elizabeth for her permission at just the right time and in the right way. It must have been a moment she missed the steady, shrewdly minded understanding of her mother's way with her relatives. Unfortunately, the right moment never seemed to come. The issue with Catherine and Edward Seymour's marriage only seemed to intensify as Parliament pushed Elizabeth to soften, and Thomas and Mary began to grow impatient. So they planned a secret wedding of their own. It's hard to understand why they would throw caution to the wind in light of Elizabeth's reaction to secret weddings, but perhaps Mary thought both Thomas and herself in her own way, were unimportant enough to get away with it. The date was set for the 16th of July, 1565. This was not randomly chosen. It was also the date of another much bigger wedding, that of Henry Knowles, a kinsman of Elizabeth's, and his bride Margaret Cave, daughter of the rich and influential courtier Ambrose Cave. The Queen was invited, and therefore she would not be around to see Mary and Thomas be married. Mary gathered in the morning with the other ladies of the court to see Elizabeth off. The wedding didn't finish until 1:30 in the early hours of the next morning, involving a feast, a ball, a tourney and masks. It gave Thomas and Mary ample time for their own special day. Mary ate in her chamber with 3 of her cousins before the wedding, before calling for a servant to meet with her. The servant girl was well liked by Mary, a girl called Frances Goldwell, and she was to be a witness to the clandestine matrimony. When Frances arrived, she found Mary waiting for Thomas along with her 3 cousins. Having learned from the problems her sister Katherine had in proving her marriage, Mary was obviously determined to be able to prove her own if needed. Thomas soon arrived, leading them to his private chambers above the Watergate, where they were to be married. At around 9 o'clock at night, their few guests gathered to watch them exchange vows, except for Margaret Willoughby, who remained outside the door with the view that she couldn't be punished if she didn't actually see anything. It took only 15 minutes or so for the quiet ceremony, vows, and a small gold ring exchanged before the guests ate and drank. The happy couple went to bed, and all seemed well. 2 weeks later, however, the rumours of the wedding would soon leak out. On the 29th of July, Elizabeth's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, married Lord Darnley at Holyrood. While Elizabeth and her parliament had once agreed this would be a good match, time had increased paranoia, and now the English Queen fretted over their claim to her throne, despite Mary's assurances that they did not want the claim. As Darnley was English and also Catholic, it would give England's enemies greater cause to rally behind the new royal couple if they ever chose to. It was not the right time to hear the news of Mary Grey's secretive marriage. William Cecil wrote to a friend, "The Sergeant Porter, being the biggest gentleman of this court, has married secretly the Lady Mary Grey, the least of all the court. The offence is very great." Elizabeth's fury knew no bounds. First, Catherine's transgression, and now the younger Mary's same crime meant that the Queen once again placed a couple under house arrest in separate places. Mary was sent to Windsor, but Thomas was sent to Fleet Prison in London. Frances Goldwell, the servant girl who was present at the wedding, was questioned by her employer, Lady Howard. Luckily for Frances, she was good at playing the naive and stupid young girl her mistress thought her to be, and pretended she hadn't understood what was going on during the ceremony. She would probably be dismissed, but friends of Mary Grey would no doubt take her into their own households. Mary's first jailer was to be the High Sheriff of Buckinghamshire, Sir William Hawtrey, who luckily for her was a kindly man friendly towards her family. His main residence was Chequers, near Ellsborough in Buckinghamshire, a newly rebuilt and comfortable home. However, Elizabeth was determined to make Mary's stay as uncomfortable as possible. Mary was not permitted to enter the gardens more than was necessary. She had to remain in her room most of the time, and she would only be allowed 2 servants and the barest amount of food required for her health. As her sister had done, Mary wrote pleading letters to William Cecil, requesting that he petition the Queen on her behalf. Unlike her sister, however, Mary did not come across to Cecil as truly apologetic, expressing surprise only a few months later in December that the Queen had still not forgiven her. To add to her case, Mary continued to sign her name Mary Grey instead of using Keys, also unlike her sister, who was signing her letters Catherine Seymour. But Elizabeth had bigger problems. Mary, Queen of Scots, was pregnant with the future James VI and I of Scotland and England, and the only alternatives for the English throne were the Grey sisters. Elizabeth, who believed in her own absolute rule as queen and dynastic succession, and hated the growing power of her parliament, who were keen to promote Catherine's case, was only convinced more to keep them imprisoned. Her fear was understandable, but even in her own time, many in her court thought she was being cruel. Mary remained for 2 years at Chequers, perhaps staring down at the gardens through the 2 only windows in her 12-foot square room. But however difficult her imprisonment was, poor Thomas Keyes was thrown into abject misery and torture at the Fleet prison. He had held a high position for the court, and as a result, his sentence was to be a cold and cruel one to represent the seriousness of his crime. He was put in solitary confinement, staying in squalid, damp conditions that made him ill, only being allowed to walk in the gardens of the prison for a few weeks when the Bishop of London, looking at his case, pleaded with Elizabeth. Thomas Keyes, desperate and miserable, even agreed to an annulment of his marriage and retirement to the countryside. Unfortunately for the unhappy couple, too many people could claim to be a witness to their matrimony. What Mary had hoped would help where it hindered Catherine, the validation of their marriage was absolute, and there was nothing the Bishop of London could do to annul it. It seemed they were doomed to remain in limbo. In 1566, Mary, Queen of Scots, gave birth to her son James at Edinburgh. Although tension had arisen between the Scottish Queen and her husband, made evident by the killing of her private secretary David Rizzio, led by Lord Darnley, she had publicly declared their reconciliation for the sake of their child. Those in Parliament who argued for Catherine's claim renewed their vigour at the birth of the Scottish prince, waiting until Elizabeth called Parliament in order to raise financial subsidies to press their council that she should marry or declare Catherine her heir. To make things worse, Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's favourite, had sided with Mary, Queen of Scots, as he was certain an accord could be struck between the 2 royal women. But either way, Elizabeth was having her hand forced. While Catherine and Edward hoped for their release to be in each other's arms again, Mary Grey was even more hopeful, fearful for the condition of her own husband. In the summer of 1566, a new jailer had taken over at the Fleet, and he had a particularly sadistic streak. Thomas Keyes had previously been allowed to prepare his own food, mainly from birds he had shot down with a sling from his window, but now he was allowed only to eat rotten meat. Thomas complained to Cecil that while he would happily endure any punishment Her Majesty wished to bestow on him, he could not bear the abuse he received from the jailer. He then discovered his food, possibly on purpose, had been dropped into the poisonous concoction used to cure mange on the dogs that guarded the Fleet. Mary feared for his life. In August 1567, Mary was moved to the household of her step-grandmother, the Duchess of Suffolk, now known as Catherine Bertie after her second marriage. The Duchess was surprised to see her when she arrived, as her previous jailer, Sir William Hawtrey, brought her almost as quickly as Elizabeth had given the order. She was shocked by how little baggage Mary had brought with her, and asked William Hawtrey to kindly send the rest along. He apologised, stating that they had brought nearly everything with them, and her few possessions were so worn that he had needed to furnish her room out of his own pockets. The Duchess was certain he was joking, until she opened her granddaughter's trunks and found what was within. Writing to William Cecil, who was one of her oldest friends, the Duchess remarked how everything Mary owned was full of holes and patched together, and that she had very little. It was beyond comprehension. Lady Mary Grey was a descendant of the Tudors, and had been raised as a young child in complete luxury. The social order at the time meant that the aristocracy was expected to put on a good show, to impress upon the public their divine place in things by wearing luxurious fabrics and living in comfortable, richly decorated houses. The main problem was that Mary's new jailer, her grandmother Katherine, was not able to fund anything herself. During Queen Mary I's reign, the Duchess had lost much of her own possessions and was often forced to borrow off friends at times. She instead appealed to Cecil to help ask for Queen Elizabeth's aid in allowing Mary to be lent some necessities, such as drinking cups and a bowl and jug to wash in. The affliction that had settled itself on so many of the Tudor women now fell on Mary, and she was melancholic to the point of not eating properly. And yet more misfortune was to befall the youngest Grey sister. Katherine, her sister, was under house arrest at what would prove to be her final residence, at Cockfield Hall under the supervision of Sir Owen Hopton. On the morning of the 27th of January, 1568, lying in her bed, Lady Catherine Grey died. Mary Grey was now all alone. Her father and eldest sister Jane had been beheaded in 1553. Her mother had passed a few years before, and now her remaining sister had died without seeing her once more, and she would find no wife's comfort in her husband's arms. But there was some comfort to be had. She got on well with her step-grandmother and was especially close to the Duchess's children, Peregrine and Susan Bertie. Perhaps their innocent enjoyment of life reminded her of better days with her sisters. But she wasn't to remain with them long. Mary Grey's two nephews, the sons of her sister Catherine, had been declared illegitimate by Elizabeth. This left Mary in a position she had never thought to find herself, a serious consideration for the throne of England, if the Queen remained childless. At the same time, Mary, Queen of Scots, had escaped her imprisonment in Scotland and fled to England. While Elizabeth had been convinced to extend a comfortable stay to her royal cousin, the same could not be said of Mary. Her stay with the Duchess of Suffolk was cut short, and she was sent to live in Gresham House in Bishopsgate, London. It was the home of a former mayor, Thomas Gresham, and he was able to afford to fund and furnish Mary where the Queen would not. However, this was not to be a happy place for Mary to stay. Thomas Gresham was half blind and in agony from a badly set broken leg, and his wife Anne, already unhappy with their marriage, resented Mary's presence in the house, complaining their charge prevented her from visiting her mother. They had lost their only son many years before, and their bitterness at life was proven in the way they treated Mary Grey. Despite the large garden and chapel that the property boasted, she was kept locked mainly in her room with her books. They became her only escape, including at least 3 Bibles and several books written in Italian and French. But finally, there was some good news. After enduring years of hell, Thomas Keyes had finally been released from the horrific, squalid conditions of the Fleet, but he still had to remain apart from his young wife. He was sent to Sandgate Castle, Kent, to carry out duties there. In May 1570, he asked the Archbishop of Canterbury if he might plead on his behalf with the Queen to be permitted to live with his wife as God intended. But Elizabeth was still immovable, and his request was denied. By 1571, Thomas Gresham was sick of playing jailer to Mary Grey, especially as it was affecting his family life, and he had decided to wow the Queen on a trip she was to make to see his newly built exchange. Then he would ask her to relieve him of the position and place Mary Grey elsewhere. Sadly, it didn't work. Once again, Elizabeth's attention and paranoia for her place on the throne were elsewhere, with Catholic plots being uncovered by William Cecil. But in the meantime, more misfortune was not far behind. After his years of anguish in prison and ill health, Thomas Keyes died before the 5th of September 1571. Members of the court knew before Mary Grey did, and her physician, Dr. Smith, arrived a few days later to break the news as gently as he could. He was to be on hand if she collapsed. As expected, the news floored her, and Mary broke down. She begged Gresham to write to Cecil and ask if she might be permitted to both raise her husband's orphan children and if she could wear mourning dress. No one was sure whether this was permitted, as the official status of her marriage was unknown. After this time, Mary's attitude changed, and she became more defiant. After recovering from the news of her husband's death, she personally wrote to Cecil, demanding the Queen release her from her imprisonment and forgive her, and for the first time, she signed her name Mary Keyes. The only known portrait of her dates from this time, and her wedding ring is made prominent in the image. She argued frequently with Lady Gresham, and Thomas Gresham's pleas to William Cecil became more urgent, begging him to restore calm to his household by the removal of Mary. Finally, in May 1572, Elizabeth agreed to release Lady Mary Grey. She was under pressure to execute Mary Queen of Scots, and perhaps she hoped this simple gesture of mercy might quieten some of the loudest voices in the Privy Council. It was suggested Mary go to live with her stepfather Adrian Stokes and his second wife Anne Carew. A few days later, Mary left the Greshams for good, with all her books and rubbish, as Thomas Gresham put it. Freedom, at last. Mary spent the first few months of her freedom at Bow Manor happily, surrounded by memories of her mother and sister Katherine. Her old room still bore her name, and Anne Carew, who had known Mary since she was a child, lavished affection and care on her. However, Mary was now a 27-year-old widow who had just earned her freedom, and it wasn't long before she wanted her own independence, no matter how happy the home. By February 1573, she was finally in her own home, setting up her household in St. Botolph's without Aldgate in London. She wrote to her brother-in-law Edward Seymour, who was now free, asking if she might employ a manservant who was currently in his own household. She was able over time to provide herself with a modest retinue of servants. It was a house far less grand than those she had known in her childhood, but after so many years with no freedom, it must have been a homely and personal place for Mary. Making up for the many years she had made done with rags and battered old furniture, she got a new feather bed and bolster, several good pieces of silverware, covered stools and tankards. After some time, she was also finally able to dress herself in the latest court fashions, adorned by the few jewels she had inherited from her mother. But most importantly, she was now free to go out in her carriage and visit family and friends. She renewed acquaintance with her young nephews and also became close to Jane Merrick, one of Thomas Keyes' daughters, becoming a godmother to Jane's young child, also named Mary. Mary was also careful to start repairing her reputation at court, finding her old friendships once more amongst those in court. Hints of her rehabilitation came in the new year of 1574, when she sent a gift of 2 pomander and agate bead bracelets to the Queen, who accepted them. It was a good sign, and the following year the income from her mother's lands, which Mary had inherited, also increased. Mary was careful during this time to keep herself in the good eyes of everyone, and while the attacks on Puritan Protestants and Catholics alike followed in the wake of the Pope's excommunication of Queen Elizabeth, she kept her religious views to herself, but she owned several books that leaned to the more Puritan, including some by preachers who attacked Elizabeth's religious settlement. But by the end of 1577, keeping her head down and making friends at court paid off for Mary. She was appointed as one of Elizabeth's maids of honour. It was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was a way of indicating Mary had been welcomed back into the court and was trusted enough to be given a respectable position within it. On the other, it was a position often given to women who were unmarried, and so was an indication of Elizabeth's feelings on the validity of her distant cousin's marriage. However, that Christmas, Mary spent it at Hampton Court. It was decorated with festoons of greenery and berries, strung in places such as the Great Hall, with strings of small oil lamps that glowed softly. Mary had another present for the Queen, 2 pairs of gloves decorated with pearl and gold buttons, and in return, the Queen gave her a cup with a cover. The Queen was now 45 years old and would no longer be able to have children. Many dropped the idea of Elizabeth marrying and now preferred the thought that she name Edward Seymour's sons as next in line. It was around this time the term Virgin Queen was coined, and the iconography of the Queen married to her country and caring only for her people instead of a husband tied in neatly with England's religious devotion to the Virgin Mary. Mary was over a decade younger than the Queen at 33 years old, but sadly, she would not see out the year after that joyful Christmas at Hampton Court. In 1578, the plague returned. Usually, the wealthy aristocrats of London would retreat to the countryside when epidemics returned, but for unknown reasons, Mary remained in her home in St. Botolph's. It's possible she thought something she owned would protect her, a large and brilliant ruby she called a mystic ruby. It was believed at the time, still in the era of medieval medicine, that such rubies were formed by the crystallized blood at the base of old unicorns' horns, and that the essence of such a ruby could protect against plague. People did not always show symptoms, especially with pneumatic forms of the plague, and Mary may not have realized she was ill until it was too late. But by the 17th of May, Mary knew she was dying and wrote up her will. In it, she left her mother's jewels to her step-grandmother Katherine, the Duchess of Suffolk. To Lady Arundel and Lady Throckmorton, Adrian Stokes' wife, she left gifts of plate, and the bulk of her money she left to Mary Merrick, Thomas Key's granddaughter. Mary also made sure all of her servants received something. 3 days later, she died, taking with her the final claim of the Grey family to the English throne. As she had for all others she had snubbed in life, Elizabeth threw a lavish funeral for the last Grey sister, ordering that Lady Mary Grey be buried in Westminster Abbey in her mother's tomb, where it remains unmarked to this day. Although Mary Grey had, like her siblings, died young, she had managed something they had not: to die in relative freedom and peace, able to make her own decisions and plans in life. Elizabeth's fears and paranoia had damaged the lives of the Grey family for reasons that linked only to the Queen's own worries about marrying and creating an heir for her throne. But even with Mary's death, there were still others waiting in the wings. Aside from Arbella Stuart was Margaret Clifford, who would face her own battles with Elizabeth in time. But now, at last, the legacy of the Grey family came to a close, and the last sister rested in peace. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.